Arsenic and Respectability, Mary and Cotton and the Limits of Victorian Justice. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, stored illegally on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Author's note. This book is a work of narrative nonfiction. It is based on primary records, contemporaneous reporting, medical literature, and modern historical analysis. Where possible, events have been reconstructed from inquest reports, trial transcripts, death certificates, insurance documentation, and 19th-century medical texts. The historical record is incomplete. Many deaths attributed to Mary and Cotton were never formally investigated. Some victims are unnamed or poorly documented. Victim counts vary widely across secondary sources, often inflated through repetition rather than evidence. For this reason, this book adopts a conservative evidentiary approach. Only cases supported by reliable documentation or strong scholarly consensus are treated as confirmed. Others are identified as probable or speculative and are clearly distinguished as such. Medical descriptions reflect 19th-century understanding and diagnostic practice. Modern terminology is used sparingly and only where it clarifies rather than distorts historical context. Forensic conclusions are framed in terms of probability, not certainty, in keeping with the limitations of both Victorian science and retrospective analysis. Dialogue has been reconstructed only where drawn directly from recorded testimony or contemporary reporting. Interior thoughts, motivations, and emotions are inferred cautiously and grounded in documented behavior rather than psychological speculation. This book prioritizes pattern over personality. Its focus is not on constructing a mythic figure of evil, but on examining how ordinary assumptions about women, care, illness, and poverty created conditions in which repeated deaths could be overlooked. Any errors are unintentional and remain the responsibility of the author. Preface. In the north of England, in the shadow of the collieries, death was never a stranger. It came early and often. It came through childbirth, through fever, through contaminated water, through accidents underground, through winters that sharpened hunger into illness. In the 19th century, especially in working districts like County Durham, people lived close to the edge of medical certainty. A child could be well at breakfast and buried by the end of the week. A husband could complain of stomach pains on Monday and be gone by Sunday. A family might lose 2 infants and still be considered merely unlucky. That closeness to death shaped what people noticed, and what they did not. It also shaped what could be hidden. Mary and Cotton has endured as a name because her story sits precisely where ordinary loss meets deliberate harm. The record is crowded with the familiar vocabulary of Victorian dying, gastric fever, bilious complaints, typhus, cholera, debility, terms that covered a wide range of suffering and often contained little diagnostic precision. Within that fog, a pattern can form and remain unseen longer than anyone likes to admit. Her life did not begin as legend. It began in a mining community, in a world of hard work and strict expectation. Born Mary Ann Robson in 1832 at Low Moorsley in County Durham, she entered a society that measured women by domestic usefulness, the girl who could help, the wife who could endure, the mother who could manage. Respectability in that world was not a luxury, it was a shield. A woman who could present as capable, pious, and unfortunate could move through tragedy with sympathy at her back. A woman who cried at the right times, who attended church, who spoke softly, who performed grief, could survive losses that might otherwise provoke questions. That performance mattered because suspicion was not evenly distributed. Men were expected to be violent in certain ways: blows, drink, loudness, public disgrace. Women were expected to harm in quieter ways, if they harmed at all: gossip, neglect, bitterness. Murder did not sit naturally on the shoulders of a wife and mother in the Victorian imagination. Even when death piled up, the mind reached first for explanations that preserved the domestic ideal. Disease helped. Victorian Britain was an age of epidemics and lingering fevers. Sanitation reforms were uneven. Medical care was expensive and often distant from the laboring poor. Many working families relied on home nursing, neighbors' advice, and patent medicines that promised relief and delivered nothing. Doctors attended when they could, but diagnosis was frequently based on observation alone. Vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, weakness, these were symptoms shared by infection, food poisoning, stress, and toxic substances alike. Even a careful practitioner could be misled when the household insisted on a familiar story: he's taken a bad stomach. Arsenic belonged to that world as both household item and quiet terror. It was not exotic. It appeared in products used to control vermin and insects. It was present in some industrial processes and could be obtained without the kind of scrutiny modern readers assume. It also had a reputation. Long before the phrase inheritance powder became shorthand, people understood that arsenic could kill without leaving obvious wounds. They also understood something more practical. Arsenic sickness could look like ordinary sickness, especially in communities accustomed to sudden decline. This is the terrain in which Mary and Cotton moved. The story that survives is built from fragments, registration entries that do not always align neatly, inquests that record conclusions without recording all reasoning, newspaper accounts shaped by appetite for horror, and trial testimony driven by the needs of prosecution and defense. It is not a clean record. It is not a modern case file. It is a Victorian one, with its silences and its assumptions. That limitation matters, because Mary and Cotton is often reduced to a number. The number most frequently repeated is the largest one, the claim that she killed as many as 21 people. It has endured because it is shocking, because it reads like certainty, and because it flatters the audience with a sense that the case is fully mapped. In reality, the record demands care. She was convicted of one murder, the death of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. Around that conviction sits a ring of suspicion: husbands, children, stepchildren, relatives, deaths that may be linked by motive and method, but that were not all proven in court. Some are strongly supported by circumstance. Some appear in sources that conflict. Some live in the gap between what happened and what could be demonstrated. A factual narrative does not need inflation. The proven facts are sufficient. Mary and Cotton married into and out of households, carrying her children with her, leaving graves behind. She survived husbands. She survived infants. She survived fevers that killed others. She sought security in a world that offered women few legitimate paths toward it. In that search, money appears repeatedly, not as greed alone, but as the harsh arithmetic of the poor. Rent, food, coal, clothing, burial costs. A funeral could ruin a family. The loss of a wage earner could push a household into the workhouse. In such a world, life insurance and burial clubs held enormous power. They promised dignity and stability in exchange for small weekly payments. They also created temptation. A policy could turn a death into cash at precisely the moment cash was most needed. In Mary and Cotton's story, insurance is not an incidental detail. It is a thread that returns again and again, sometimes openly, sometimes through implication. The pressure to insure, the timing of claims, the urgency to secure payouts, the speed with which one household ends and another begins. The same society that expected women to be dependent also required them to be resourceful. Those expectations sit uncomfortably beside one another. They create space for a woman to argue necessity while acting with calculation. Necessity and calculation are not opposites in this record. They are often intertwined. What makes the case enduring is not only the allegation of repeated poisoning, but the way domestic life itself becomes the setting and the disguise. Meals, nursing, cups of tea, broth, powders, the gentle routines of care, these are not scenes that raise alarm. They are scenes that reassure. When harm is delivered through care, detection becomes emotionally difficult as well as medically difficult. It requires loved ones to imagine betrayal at the bedside. It requires a community to accept that death may have been administered by the person expected to prevent it. That is why patterns are so important. A single bad stomach can be misfortune. Two can be coincidence. A cluster, children, then a husband, then another, begins to look like something else. But even then, recognition is slow. People resist it. They protect themselves by refusing to see what cannot be repaired. In poor communities, suspicion can destroy the fragile network that keeps people alive. To accuse a neighbor is to risk isolation. To accuse a woman is to accuse the household itself. Silence can feel safer than truth, until truth becomes unavoidable. When the case finally broke, it did not break because Victorian society suddenly learned to see women differently. It broke because one death created a narrative that held together under scrutiny: a child, an insurance plan, an illness that fit the old pattern too neatly, and enough witness observation to make doubt plausible. Once doubt existed, The old shield of domestic assumption began to crack. The authorities moved. The press arrived. The story was transformed into spectacle. In that transformation, Mary Ann Cotton became less a person than a symbol. She became the Black Widow, the murderous mother, the woman who violated the domestic ideal so completely that she had to be cast as unnatural. The Victorian press excelled at turning complex lives into moral theatre. Female criminals were particularly valuable because they could be used to warn other women and to reassure men, she is not like you. She is not like the women you know. She is an aberration. This framing is seductive. It offers distance. A more unsettling reading sits closer to the ground. Mary Ann Cotton was not a supernatural monster. She appears, in the surviving descriptions, as ordinary enough to pass. That ordinariness is part of the horror. The women around her were not waiting for sensational evil. They were living in a world where illness was common and medical certainty rare. They watched children sicken and die across the neighborhood. They watched men cough themselves into graves. They were primed to accept death as routine, and routine makes room for concealment. A factual account must hold two truths at once: that Mary Ann Cotton moved through an environment shaped by poverty, illness, and gendered constraint, and that within that environment, responsibility still exists. Context explains how something can happen. It does not absolve it. The victims, too, must be held with care. They are often reduced to roles: husband, child, stepson. They were people who lived within the same hard conditions: laborers, miners, shipwrights, boys who were old enough to run errands and young enough to still trust the adults around them. Their lives mattered even if the record records them briefly. In a case like this, victims disappear quickly beneath the perpetrator's notoriety. Names blur. Dates become arguments. Causes of death become disputed phrases. What remains is the ethical task of telling the story without turning it into entertainment. This is true crime, and it is also social history, a portrait of how easily domestic death could be normalized, how insurance could distort grief, how medicine could be defeated by a poison that imitated the illnesses of the poor, and how a woman could move through suspicion by wearing the expected face of widowhood. There is no need to promise certainty where the record cannot provide it. There is no need to sharpen rumor into fact. The strongest narrative is the honest one that distinguishes between what was proven, what was alleged, and what was likely but never demonstrated. Mary Ann Cotton's story endures because it forces an uncomfortable recognition. The home, idealized as moral center, can also be the most private place to do harm. The language of care can be used as cover. Grief can be performed. Sympathy can be harvested. And in a society trained to believe that mothers do not kill, the simplest lies are often the ones that last longest. In the end, the question is not only what Mary Ann Cotton did, but what the world around her allowed to be unseen. That is where the darkness sits, not only in one woman, but in the conditions that let repeated tragedy pass as fate until the right death, in the right place, finally made doubt louder than sympathy. Chapter 1. Low Morsley, A Childhood Built Around the Pit. Mary Ann Robson was born on October 31, 1832 at Low Morsley, a County Durham village shaped by coal and the precarious life that gathered around it. Low Morsley sat in a landscape where employment meant the mine, and where the mine meant risk, long hours, rough wages, injury, and sudden death. In such places, families learned early that survival depended on routine, thrift, and endurance. A household could be steady one month and undone the next by a fall underground, a fever, or the loss of a single wage. Her father, Michael Robson, worked as a colliery sinker, a job tied to the most dangerous parts of pit labor: shafts, depth, and the work required to make the mine usable at all. Her mother, Margaret, née Lonsdale, ran the domestic economy as working-class women were expected to do, stretching food, managing children, keeping order, keeping appearances, and absorbing grief when the household was struck. In Mary Ann's early years, the rhythm of life would have been ordinary by local standards. The pit bell, the return of men blackened with coal dust, the hush that fell when there was an accident, the whispered talk of who had been crushed or burned or suffocated. The difference between a day that ended normally and one that ended with a knock at the door was thin. Childhood in County Durham did not offer much distance from adult reality. The home was not a separate, protected sphere, it was part of the working machine. Children carried water, watched younger siblings, ran errands, helped where they could. Cleanliness was prized, not because it guaranteed health, but because it marked a family as respectable in a world quick to judge the poor as careless. Mary Ann was baptized at St. Mary's, West Rainton, on November 11, 1832. That detail matters less as piety than as social fact. Baptism anchored a child in the record, in a parish, in a community that tracked the living and the dead through church books long before anyone spoke of case files or serial crime. Merton, a move that narrowed the household's margin. When Mary Ann was still a child, her parents moved the family to Merton. It was not an unusual shift. Mining families moved when work moved, or when housing was tied to employment, or when the next colliery offered a slightly better chance. The pit decided geography. Merton did not offer safety. It offered the same bargain with different seams of coal. What it did offer, briefly, was the sense of routine a family relies on, a father employed, a roof secured through his labor, a household continuing. That stability ended abruptly. In February 1842, Michael Robson fell roughly 150 feet down a mine shaft at Merton Colliery and died. The detail is brutal, and it is also typical of the period's industrial violence, sudden, unpreventable by families, and often treated as the price of bread. Mary Ann was 9. The story recorded later includes an image that captures the coldness of working life: Michael Robson's body delivered to his widow in a sack stamped with the name of a coal company. Whether every part of that image was repeated exactly as it happened or sharpened by later retelling, it reflects the same truth. A man could be reduced to property even in death, and the household that depended on him could be treated as an afterthought. With his death, the family's housing was threatened. Colliery cottages were tied to employment. Lose the job, lose the roof. A widow with children did not simply grieve, she calculated what had to be done immediately to keep them from eviction. A mother remarries, and the household reorganizes. In 1843, Margaret Robson remarried George Stott, also a miner. This was not romance in the modern sense. It was a survival solution that many widows pursued when they could. It meant a wage returning to the household. It meant the difference between keeping a roof and being pushed toward parish relief or the workhouse system. For a child, remarriage could be stabilizing and destabilizing at once. A new adult entered the home. Authority shifted. The family's story changed. A girl might be expected to obey a stepfather's rules while still carrying loyalty to the dead father who had set the household's first shape. The record does not give a neat emotional map of Mary Ann's childhood under her stepfather. What it does show is that she maintained an outward respectability that would later matter in how people interpreted her. At the time of her trial, a newspaper described her childhood conduct in language that reads like a character reference: a regular attender at Wesleyan Sunday School, innocent in disposition, average intelligence, and notably clean and tidy in appearance. That description cannot be treated as proof of inner nature. It is a public portrait, drawn through the values of the time. But it reveals the sort of girl she was believed to be, the kind who could move through a community without being marked as troublesome. In the Victorian world, that counted for more than warmth. It was social insurance. Cleanliness and order were moral signs. A tidy girl was presumed honest. A tidy woman was presumed safe. The domestic ideal ran deep. Women were expected to create virtue through household management. Even poverty, if carried neatly, could be reframed as respectability. Mary Ann learned early how to meet that gaze. Leaving home, service, nursing, and the education of the bedside. At 16, she left home to work as a nurse in South Hetton, in the household of Edward Potter, a manager at Merton Colliery. This was a significant shift. Service work placed a young woman inside another class's domestic life. It taught skills, but it also taught observation: how households are structured, how illness is managed, how grief is performed, how people speak when they believe servants are not listening. Nursing in a private household was not the professionalized role later generations imagine. It was care work: washing, watching, preparing food, changing bedding, keeping sickness contained. It required competence and a steady stomach. It required the ability to remain calm when bodies failed. In the Victorian North, illness was common and treatment was often blunt. Families used mixtures, powders, tonics, and whatever remedies were available. Symptoms were interpreted through habit and local knowledge. The same stomach pains that could signal infection might also be blamed on poor food or a chill. Death could arrive without ever receiving a precise name. A young woman working close to illness learnt what sickness looked like, how quickly it could change, and how much could be done, often very little, before death claimed the patient anyway. Mary Ann later trained as a dressmaker after returning to her stepfather's home. Dressmaking offered a different kind of mobility. It brought a woman into close contact with other women, with marriages and births and mourning clothes. It sat at the edge of the life cycle economy, weddings, funerals, the constant remaking of a household's appearance. Between nursing and dressmaking, she acquired two kinds of knowledge that mattered in her adult life: the practical knowledge of bodies and the social knowledge of presentation. Neither makes a murderer. Both are tools that can be used for many ends. Marriage as exit, William Mowbray. In 1852, at 20, Mary Ann married William Mowbray at Newcastle upon Tyne Register Office. He was a colliery labourer, a working man from the same broad world of coal and wage insecurity. The marriage offered what marriages usually offered to women of her class: a sanctioned household, a legitimate identity, and the hope of stability. It also offered movement. Soon after marrying, the couple moved away from County Durham into southwest England. This relocation is one of the first patterns that will repeat. Mary Ann attached herself to the possibility of a better life elsewhere, and when life soured, through poverty, illness, death, she moved again. In the years following the marriage, children arrived. The Victorian world expected that. It also expected that some would die. Infant mortality was not a scandal, it was a lived reality. What would later raise suspicion was not the presence of death itself, but its density around one woman across multiple households. Records from this early period are incomplete. Births and deaths were supposed to be registered, but enforcement was inconsistent before later legal tightening. That gap matters because it creates a fog that later storytellers often exploit, turning uncertainty into certainty, and rumor into total numbers. What can be anchored is that one daughter, Margaret Jane, was born at St. Germans in 1856. She died in 1860. Another daughter, Isabella, was born in 1858. Another girl, also named Margaret Jane, was born in 1861. A son, John Robert William, was born in 1863 and died in 1864, recorded as gastric fever in later summaries. Even without embellishment, the shape is clear: repeated child loss inside a working-class marriage. In most households, this would have been filed under misfortune, because misfortune was common. But repeated loss also changes a person. It can hollow grief into numbness. It can harden a woman's view of the future. It can turn attachment into calculation, especially when survival depends on making hard decisions quickly. In this period, Mary Ann was not a public figure. She was one woman among many, moving through the same hazards as her neighbors, learning what she could about keeping a household together. A domestic education in numbers and necessity. The Victorian poor understood money as pressure, not as abstract concept. Rent came weekly. Food was a constant worry. Coal was essential. Clothing wore out. A funeral could swallow savings and debt could swallow the rest. There was no cushion. The household existed in a narrow corridor where one disaster could topple everything. For women, the corridor was narrower still. Employment was available, but low-paid and conditional. Respectability mattered because it determined who would hire you, who would trust you, who would speak well of you to the next employer. A woman who lost a husband could slide quickly toward the workhouse system if she had no family willing to take her in. Mary Ann's early life taught her how fragile security was, and how quickly a home could be lost. Her father's death had shown her that labor could end in an instant. Her mother's remarriage had shown her that survival often required swift, practical decisions. Nursing had shown her how easily illness could be accepted as explanation. Marriage had shown her that a husband's wage did not guarantee safety, and that children could disappear without the world stopping. This is the foundation of the later story, not as prophecy, but as context. The crimes Mary Ann Cotton is remembered for did not arise from an exotic life. They arose from a recognizable one: working-class hardship, repeated bereavement, and a society structured to interpret domestic women as carers by default. Those assumptions would later function as cover. For now, in these early years, they functioned as the ordinary rules of survival, rules Mary Ann learned to follow and to use. By the mid-1860s, the Mowbray household would fracture under illness and death, and Mary Ann would re-enter the world as a widow, one of the most socially precarious positions a Victorian woman could occupy, and one that also carried a strange kind of power, the power of sympathy, and the power of starting again. Chapter 2: William Mowbray. Mary Ann's marriage to William Mowbray in 1852 was, on the surface, an ordinary working-class union. It carried the expected promise: a respectable household, a husband's wage, children, and the small hard pride of being a married woman rather than a servant moving through other people's homes. In County Durham, marriage did not guarantee comfort, but it did confer a recognized place in the world. It also provided a kind of cover. A married woman was meant to be rooted. She belonged to a man, a home, a parish. She was not meant to drift. If she did drift, there was usually a reason that sounded respectable enough to silence questions: work, rent, family necessity, the logic of the pit. Mary and William did drift. They moved repeatedly, traveling far from the communities where Mary had grown up and away from the eyes that might have watched too closely. A household that refused to stay still. The Mowbrays left the northeast and traveled to southwest England. Movement like this could be driven by labor, particularly for men whose work shifted from colliery to colliery or into other industrial roles. It could also be driven by debt, by conflict, by the simple search for a cheaper room and a fresh start. Frequent relocation matters in Mary Ann's story because it disrupts continuity. Each move loosens community memory. It breaks the chain of neighbors who have watched a woman's seasons of pregnancy, grief, and recovery. It dilutes the effect of repeated tragedy. A woman who buries a child in one village and arrives pregnant in another is greeted as a stranger carrying no known pattern. In the Victorian working class, such movement was common enough not to be inherently suspicious. But it had consequences. It made it easier for death to be absorbed as misfortune rather than seen as accumulation. Children and the normalization of loss. Mary Ann became a mother in a world where motherhood was both expectation and hazard. Victorian infant and child mortality was high, and families of her class were surrounded by illness. Death in early childhood was not rare. It was expected enough that people developed social scripts for it: the funeral, the brief period of mourning, the return to work, the next pregnancy. This does not mean parents were unaffected. It means grief had to be carried inside ongoing labor. A household could not stop because a baby died. The rent did not pause. Food still needed to be found. Women still needed to cook, wash, fetch, nurse. Within the Mowbray marriage, multiple children were born, and several died young. Records from this period are incomplete, and later summaries sometimes disagree or inflate. What can be said without forcing certainty is that Mary Ann experienced repeated child loss before she was 30, and that those deaths were accepted within their communities as part of the rough pattern of working life. One child, Margaret Jane, was born in 1856 and died in 1860. Another daughter, Isabella, was born in 1858 and survived into later childhood. A second child named Margaret Jane was born in 1861 and later died of typhus. A son, John Robert William, was born in 1863 and died in 1864, commonly described in surviving accounts as gastric fever. Even stripped of drama, the sequence carries weight. A woman who buries more than one child begins to occupy a particular social position: pitted, sympathized with, treated as unfortunate, sometimes treated as marked. And the more often death comes, the more readily the mind accepts it. The language of illness as cover. The Victorian medical vocabulary that surrounds Mary Ann's early losses is important. It reveals how easily death could be filed under familiar causes without the need for deeper inquiry. Gastric fever was a loose term. It could be used to describe a range of illnesses that produced stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, collapse. Typhoid could appear this way. Foodborne illness could appear this way. Cholera and other infections could echo some of the same symptoms. In working-class districts, where sanitation was patchy and water could be contaminated, stomach illness was so common that it rarely provoked alarm. This matters because arsenic poisoning produces symptoms that can resemble those illnesses: severe abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration, collapse. In an age without modern toxicology as routine practice, without systematic postmortems for poor families, and without consistent medical attendance at every death, the boundary between sickness and poisoning could be thin. A household that reported bad stomach would not automatically be doubted, particularly if the household was already known for poverty and strain. In this period of Mary Ann's life, there is no single moment where the record forces a conclusion that she was poisoning her children. What exists is the context in which poisoning could later be alleged, a domestic environment where stomach illness was normalized and where repeated childhood death did not compel investigation. The early presence of money as pressure. Money appears repeatedly in Mary Ann's story, but it must be understood as pressure before it is understood as greed. The working poor lived in a weekly economy. Many belonged to burial clubs or mutual aid arrangements. Some had small insurance policies. These systems existed because death was so common and funerals were costly. A decent burial mattered. It signaled respectability. It kept a family from shame as well as from debt. Insurance and burial funds also created an opportunity. A death could become a payout at the moment a household was most desperate for cash. The historical record shows Mary and repeatedly connected to insurance arrangements across her life. In the Mowbray years, this pattern begins to emerge. It is not necessary to treat every policy as proof of murder. Many families insured children or spouses for burial expenses. But in Mary Ann's case, the repeated alignment of death and payout becomes significant later, especially when it is paired with her rapid transitions into new households. In a factual narrative, it is enough to say this: the household world Mary Ann inhabited made insurance meaningful, and she learned how to use systems designed for protection as systems that could be exploited. William Mowbray, Work, Illness, and Decline. William Mowbray's work appears in the record as labor tied to industrial life, hard, unstable, and physically punishing. The precise details of his employment shift across accounts, reflecting the reality that working men did not hold one consistent role for decades. They moved with work, took what they could, adapted. Over time, William's health deteriorated. He experienced a prolonged illness described in period language as an intestinal or stomach complaint. In January 1865, he died. This is the first adult male death that places Mary Ann in the role she would occupy again and again, the widow. Widowhood in Victorian England was not merely personal grief. It was legal and economic vulnerability. A widow could lose her home if it was tied to the husband's work. She could be left with children and no reliable wage. She could be pushed toward parish relief or the workhouse system. Remarriage was often the quickest path back to stability. But widowhood could also carry a kind of social advantage. A widow was treated as a figure deserving sympathy. Her mourning was socially sanctioned. She could receive help, at least briefly. She could appeal to employers or landlords as someone trying to keep her children alive. She could move through the world under the cloak of misfortune. Mary Ann's later life shows how effectively she used that cloak. The Mowbray years are where she learns the shape of it. The problem of proof and the temptation of hindsight. It is easy in a story like this to look back at William Mowbray's death and declare it the first confirmed murder. That is not supported by the surviving legal record. His death was not the one that brought her to trial. It was not the one that produced a conviction. It is part of the cluster of suspicious deaths that later writers gather into totals. A factual account must resist the temptation of hindsight. William died in a time and place where men did die of stomach illness. He died in a domestic environment where nursing was informal and medical intervention often minimal. If Mary Ann poisoned him, she did so in a context that made such an act difficult to detect. If he died naturally, his death still served the same practical function in Mary Ann's life. It forced a transition. What can be said without speculation is that his death placed Mary Ann at a crossroads, and that her decisions after his death reveal a repeated pattern. She moved quickly toward the next source of stability: widowhood and the speed of reinvention. After William's death, Mary Ann did not remain anchored in one place. She returned north. She sought work connected to care and illness, including environments where nursing skills were valued. This is not unusual for a woman with her background. Nursing and service were among the few respectable employments available. But there is a deeper significance in her proximity to illness and medical environments. Nursing provided legitimate contact with sickness. It provided familiarity with symptoms. It taught how bodies decline. It also offered a ready explanation for why a woman might handle medicines, powders, and mixtures. A nurse could be associated with care rather than suspicion. For Mary Ann, the line between skill and opportunity would later become a central issue. She was not ignorant. She was not a naïve blundering into tragedy. She understood sickness. She knew how to present herself within it. The widow returning to nursing is, in itself, a story of survival. In Mary Ann's case, it becomes part of the larger record of how she navigated public perception. The surviving children and the quiet aftermath. William's death left children still living. Their survival complicates the simple narrative of a woman killing every child in her care. Marianne's story is not one of total annihilation. It is a story of repeated loss and selective survival, which is part of what made it possible for her to remain in sympathy rather than suspicion for so long. A mother whose children all die attracts alarm even in a high-mortality society. A mother whose children die often, but not always, can still be framed as unfortunate. Survival blurs patterns and makes tragedy feel random. It also creates a practical reality. Mary had dependents to carry with her or leave behind. Decisions about children, who stayed, who moved, who was placed with relatives, were not simply emotional. They were economic. A widow's capacity to feed children determined her prospects. Too many dependents could make remarriage less likely, employment harder, landlords less tolerant. This tension appears repeatedly later, the conflict between motherhood as expectation and motherhood as burden in a life lived close to the edge. A pattern begins to harden. By the time William Mowbray died in 1865, several elements that would define Mary and Cotton's later life were already in place. Repeated child death normalized by the era's realities. Illness framed in broad terms that did not invite deeper scrutiny. Movement between regions and communities. Reliance on respectability and the sympathetic role of widowhood. The recurring presence of insurance and financial pressure. A woman skilled in nursing and domestic care, able to perform grief convincingly enough to avoid immediate suspicion. None of this proves murder. It proves environment and capability. And it sets the stage for what comes next, because Marianne's next marriage followed quickly, and it followed the same logic. A widow moving toward a household that offered stability, a husband connected to industrial work, and another death that would be explained once again through the language of illness. In the next phase of her life, the record becomes sharper. Names and dates become clearer. The pattern becomes harder for those around her to ignore. The deaths begin to cluster in ways that strain even Victorian tolerance for misfortune. The shift begins with her second husband, George Ward. Chapter 3, George Ward. By the time Mary returned north after William Mowbray's death, she carried more than grief. She carried experience. Widowhood had taught her how quickly a household could collapse, and how fragile respectability became when rent, food, and clothing depended on one wage. The death of a husband did not simply end a marriage. It ended shelter, structure, and social protection. In the Victorian working class, a widow with children faced a narrowing set of options: service, nursing, dependence on relatives, parish relief, or remarriage. Mary chose the path that preserved both income and appearance. She went back into care work. Nursing offered wages, but it also offered status of a particular kind. A nurse was not a lady, but she was useful. She belonged in sick rooms. She handled medicine. She knew symptoms. She could speak the language of illness without sounding ignorant or theatrical. In a society that trusted women to care and mistrusted them to harm, nursing placed Mary in the safest possible role for a woman who would later be accused of using sickness as cover. It also placed her close to men who were already unwell. A marriage formed in a medical world. Mary met George Ward through the orbit of nursing and industrial life. Ward was employed as an engineer. He was not wealthy, but he was skilled, and skill carried steadier wages than casual labor. In working communities, an engineer represented a rung above the pit laborer, still a man of the industrial machine, but one with a trade that could travel. They married on August 28, 1865. The speed of the remarriage did not mock Mary as unusual. It mocked her as practical. Widows remarried quickly for survival. A woman's grief did not pay rent. What drew attention later was not the speed alone, but how often the same pattern repeated: marriage, illness, death, and the next start. At the time, Ward's family and neighbors could still accept the story as misfortune. Marianne's recent widowhood created sympathy. Ward's marriage to a woman who had already buried a husband and children would have been read as charitable as much as romantic. A man giving stability to a widow, a woman restoring a household to order. That public framing mattered. It softened scrutiny before it began. Illness with a plausible face. Ward did not die suddenly. His illness stretched, creating time for the sickroom routine to settle in. Long illness in the Victorian era often moved in cycles: improvement that gave hope, relapse that brought fear, then a decline that felt inevitable. Families did not always call a doctor repeatedly. Costs were high and treatment options limited. Many households managed illness at home until the body made that impossible. The symptoms described in later accounts resemble the same broad category that appears elsewhere in Marianne's story: stomach pain, sickness, weakness, a wasting kind of decline. In the language of the time, these were common. They could be attributed to typhoid, cholera-like infections, contaminated water, poor food, or a chill. They could also be made to resemble arsenic poisoning, which produces violent gastrointestinal distress. This is the central difficulty in the ward period. The illness looks plausible either way. The record does not provide a clean clinical chart. It offers the kind of information Victorian cases often do: fragments from later testimony, the memory of neighbors, the moral shape imposed by the eventual accusation. When the end of a story is known, earlier illness is reread as evidence. Symptoms become suspicious because someone has decided they should be. That does not mean the suspicion is wrong. It means the narrative must be handled carefully. The usefulness of care as disguise. The sick room created a private stage. A man who was already ill would be fed small amounts. Drinks would be offered in teaspoons. Medicines would be administered as powders or mixtures. A nurse wife would be expected to handle these things without question. The very behaviors that might look suspicious in another context, preparing a drink, insisting on a particular remedy, controlling who enters the room, become normal inside the logic of care. A woman who wanted to harm through poison could not ask for a better setting than a household nursing an adult man with gastrointestinal illness. Everything fits. Everything is explained. The body's reactions align with common disease. The caregiver's presence is constant. The husband's trust is assumed. This is why Marianne's later crimes, if the allegations are accepted, were not an aberration from domestic life but an exploitation of it. Domesticity did not hinder the act. It made it easier. Death and the return of the widow. George Ward died on October 20, 1866. In the social world Marianne moved through, his death restored her to the role that by then had become strangely functional for her, the grieving widow. Victorian communities responded to widowhood with sympathy and practical offers of help. A woman could be treated as pitiable rather than suspicious, especially when the death was framed as illness and when the family had already experienced loss. But sympathy also had limits. Neighbors watched. Patterns did register, even if people struggled to name them. A woman could be unlucky once. Twice still sat within the boundaries of a hard life. Beyond that, whispers begin. At Ward's death, Marianne was still close enough to ordinary misfortune to remain under the shelter of common explanation. Working men died. Stomach illness was common. Medical certainty was rare. What mattered was what happened next. The economy of mourning. Victorian grief had rules. There were clothes. There were expected behaviors. A widow was meant to perform sorrow publicly. She was meant to speak of her loss in appropriate language, to appear subdued, to carry herself with modesty. Her emotional state was judged by her appearance and her willingness to conform to ritual. Marianne understood those rules. A woman does not have to be sincere to meet social expectation. She only has to be competent at it. In communities trained to read women through domestic virtue, competence can be mistaken for goodness. The widow who behaves correctly is trusted. The widow who remarries quickly is excused if she is poor. The widow who carries children is pitied. This is the tightrope Marianne walked repeatedly, meeting enough expectation to avoid censure, moving quickly enough to avoid poverty. Insurance, money, and the arithmetic of survival. Money sits close to Ward's death in the surviving record, as it does elsewhere in her life. The Victorian working class increasingly used life insurance and burial clubs. These were not luxuries. They were strategies against debt. A small weekly payment could prevent a family from having to beg for burial costs. It also meant that, in death, a household could briefly have cash rather than only loss. In Marianne's story, the repeated presence of insurance becomes significant because it ties death to practical gain, and because it appears alongside other repeated behaviors, movement, remarriage, and the clustering of stomach illness around her. It is not necessary to insist that insurance alone equals motive. It is enough to recognize the reality. For a poor woman, an insurance payout could change a life. It could clear debt, secure rent, fund a move, provide clothing, make remarriage possible. And for a woman with limited lawful access to independent income, it could offer a kind of power. The narrowing circle of people who knew her. every death around Mary and removed someone who had known her in one phase and forced her into another. A husband's family might grieve and then drift away. A village might remember her briefly, then watch her leave. Each new marriage placed her among new people with incomplete knowledge of her past. Even when rumors traveled, they traveled in pieces. A new household often heard only a softened version. She was unlucky, she had suffered, she had been through so much. This made her both familiar and mysterious. Familiar because she performed the expected role, mysterious because her past was crowded with graves. That mixture can paralyze suspicion. People hesitate to accuse someone who seems respectable and already marked by tragedy. It feels cruel. It feels uncharitable. It feels like blaming the victim. The role protected her. The shape of repetition begins to show. By late 1866, Mary Ann had buried 2 husbands. In isolation, each death could be explained. Together, they created a pattern that some people would later claim they noticed at the time. Whether those claims are accurate is difficult to prove. Many people only noticed after arrest reshaped memory. What can be said is that the conditions for noticing were forming. 2 husbands dead. Children dead. A woman still standing. A woman still searching for stability. A woman who did not remain where the grief occurred but moved on, as if reinvention was not only possible but necessary. This is the point where her story moves from tragedy into something more unstable. Because after Ward's death, Mary Ann did not retreat into long mourning. She entered another household quickly, not as wife at first, but as worker. And in that household, death would begin to cluster in a way that could not be absorbed as ordinary misfortune as easily as before. James Robinson's home would become the place where private suspicion finally gained shape. Chapter 4: The Robinson Household. After George Ward's death, Mary Ann did what widows without money often did. She looked for work that kept her respectable and kept her fed. Domestic service and nursing were still among the few occupations available to working-class women that did not openly compromise their standing. A woman could enter another home as housekeeper without being treated as suspect. She could be trusted with children, meals, and sickbeds because society insisted that women were naturally suited to care. Mary Ann entered the Robinson household in this context, and it was there, inside an ordinary working home, that the pattern of death began to tighten. This period matters because it contains the first cluster that is consistently remembered as unsettling even by those who were inclined to excuse misfortune. It is the point where tragedy stops feeling random and begins to look organized. James Robinson, a widower looking for order. James Robinson was a shipwright, a skilled working man in Sunderland's industrial world. He had been married before. His wife, Mary Robinson, died after giving birth, leaving him with children and a household that had lost its center. In Victorian England, a widower with children often remarried quickly or hired a woman to restore domestic function. The home required management, and men of his class were rarely trained for the constant labor of child care and household routine. Mary Ann was hired as housekeeper. On paper, it was a straightforward arrangement, a widower bringing in a capable woman to help him manage his children and maintain respectability. It was not unusual, and it created a proximity that often led to marriage. A housekeeper in a man's home was constantly present. She cooked his meals, tended his children, handled his laundry, kept his domestic reputation intact. The boundary between employee and partner could blur quickly, particularly if both were viewed as socially eligible. Mary Ann had already proven that she could occupy such roles convincingly. She was not a young servant girl. She was a widow with experience, a woman who knew how to run a household and present herself properly. To a widower, she could look like stability. The household as pressure point. The Robinson home brought together grief, children, financial necessity, and a stranger moving into intimate daily space. It was a household already shaped by recent death. The children were motherless. The man was trying to hold the family together while working. The housekeeper held authority inside the home by sheer presence. In such circumstances, the emotional temperature is often higher than outsiders realize. Children cling and resist. A widower struggles to maintain order. A woman brought in to manage the home must exert control quickly or be swallowed by chaos. The home becomes a closed system. What happens inside it is largely unseen from outside. This is where the story turns. The first deaths in the Robinson orbit. Within a short period of Mary Ann's arrival, death entered the house again, repeatedly. First, Her daughter Isabella Mowbray, who had survived earlier childhood, fell ill with severe stomach pains and died. Isabella's death matters because she was not an infant. She was old enough to have a recognizable pattern of health and behavior. When an older child dies suddenly after a stomach complaint, the household must manage not only grief but fear. It raises questions in a way an infant death might not, because older children are assumed to be less fragile. Then James Robinson's children began to die. Elizabeth Robinson died. Soon after, another child, James Robinson the son, also died. The sequence is remembered as tight: multiple child deaths in a small window, each presenting as illness that could be explained through common causes but that, as repetition, strained belief. In working communities, childhood illness could sweep through a home. Infectious disease did not always respect household boundaries. But a cluster still changes the atmosphere. It creates unease. People begin to watch the caregiver. Neighbors begin to whisper. A household that buries one child may be pitied. A household that buries several begins to be marked. For Mary Ann, this cluster did not provoke immediate intervention. It provoked something more subtle, suspicion that remained private until it could be articulated. Illness that followed the same script. The symptoms described across these child deaths fit the familiar Victorian script of gastric trouble, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, collapse. The script was believable because it mirrored the illnesses of the poor: contaminated water, bad food, infectious fevers, winter weakness, childhood vulnerability. It was also the script arsenic could hide inside. This is the disturbing overlap that runs through the entire case. Arsenic sickness could be passed off as common sickness, especially in children. A child could be sick by morning and dead within days. The household could say gastric fever and be believed, because the era supplied 1,000 other children who died the same way without any poison at all. In the Robinson house, what shifted was not the symptoms but the number of times the symptoms appeared around the same woman. Marriage, the step from worker to wife. After the deaths, Mary and James Robinson married on August 11, 1867. On the surface, this too could be explained as practical. A widower marries his housekeeper. A woman secures her position. The household regains social respectability. The children gain a mother figure. The community can accept the arrangement without scandal. But marriage also changes power. A housekeeper can be dismissed. A wife cannot be removed as easily. A wife gains access to a man's money, his insurance, his goods. She has legal standing. She becomes central to the household rather than peripheral. In Mary Ann's life, marriage often followed death quickly. In the Robinson period, marriage followed a cluster of child deaths that already unsettled the household. That sequence becomes critical later, because it is the period in which James Robinson himself begins to see her not as unlucky, but as dangerous. The baby who died, and the baby who lived. After marrying Robinson, Mary Ann gave birth to a daughter, often recorded as Margaret Isabella or Mary Isabella Robinson. The child died in early 1868. Again, infant death alone does not prove crime. But the death lands in a household already marked by multiple child deaths, already carrying the shape of repetition. In 1869, Mary Ann gave birth to a son, George Robinson, who survived. This survival matters. It is part of what made her trail harder to interpret. A woman whose children die often can still be read as tragic rather than lethal. A woman whose children all die would more readily provoke scrutiny. The survival of some children blurs the pattern. It allows communities to continue seeing her as unfortunate rather than malevolent. It also suggests that whatever was happening, whether natural or deliberate, was not indiscriminate. Survival and death sat side by side, and that mixed outcome kept certainty out of reach. Insurance pressure and the shift in Robinson's perception. If the Robinson household is the moment where the pattern tightens, it is also the moment where Mary Ann's relationship with money becomes less deniable. James Robinson later described behavior that disturbed him: the pressure to insure, the urgency around payouts, the sense that death was being treated as opportunity. In Victorian working households, insurance could be normal, but the tone around it mattered. A man might insure his children for burial expenses without being accused of preparing to kill them. But a woman who seems too eager for the policy, too focused on the claim, begins to look predatory. Robinson began to notice details that, in hindsight, read like warning signs. He became suspicious of her interest in insurance. He became suspicious of her handling of household funds. He became suspicious of the way illness seemed to arrive on schedule. Suspicion inside a marriage is not a single moment. It accumulates. It begins as discomfort, then shifts into quiet observation, then into checking pockets, checking bottles, checking what is said against what is done. Theft, pawning, and the unraveling of the household. Alongside the deaths, Mary Ann's relationship with property became another fracture point. Items disappeared. Clothing and household goods were pawned. Money went missing. These were common survival behaviors among the poor, but they were also behaviors that could signal deception inside the home. A man who works hard for wages often tolerates poverty more easily than dishonesty. Poverty is expected. Theft inside the household feels like betrayal. Robinson's suspicion hardened into action when he discovered that Mary Ann had been forging his signature and pawning goods. This matters because it shows a practical, calculated side to her behavior that aligns with later allegations. It also shows that not everyone around her remained passive. Some men did notice. Some men acted. Robinson survived precisely because he stopped accepting the domestic story she presented. Robinson expels her and keeps the child. Eventually, Robinson threw Mary Ann out. This was not a symbolic separation. It was a decisive rejection of her presence in his household. He kept their son George with him. That detail is significant and often overlooked. A Victorian man did not always keep a child when the mother left. Mothers were assumed to be caregivers. For a father to keep the child suggests that Robinson believed the child was safer away from her. It also suggests that Robinson's fear was not abstract. He did not simply mistrust her with money. He mistrusted her with life. Mary Ann left the household without the child she had borne, and that loss would follow her story like a shadow. It reduced her to the identity she knew how to use best, a woman alone, forced to begin again, carrying grief and misfortune as social camouflage. Why this household is the turning point. The Robinson period is often treated as one chapter in a long string of marriages, but it is more than that. It is the first place where a man close to her did not die but lived long enough to describe what he saw and to withdraw from her before she could secure the household permanently. It is also the first period where multiple child deaths occur in such close proximity around her in a way that produced lasting suspicion. The case against Mary Ann Cotton, as it would later be formed, relies heavily on the idea of pattern, that death followed her from house to house, that illness arrived where she had access, that money and insurance sat beside each tragedy. The Robinson household is where those elements converge sharply enough that the narrative becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Mary Ann left Robinson's house and moved on. That movement is itself part of the story. When suspicion rose, she did not stay to endure it. She relocated into a new household, away from the man who had begun to recognize her shape. She would marry again. She would attach herself to another widower. She would enter another home where children already existed. And in that next home, the story would tighten to its final stage. The Cotton household was not merely another marriage. It was where the last victims fell, where the workhouse plan drew attention, and where the death of one child created a case strong enough to break the pattern open publicly. Chapter 5: Frederick Cotton and the West Auckland Marriage. By 1870, Mary Ann Cotton had already lived a life that trained her in two things: how quickly security could vanish, and how easily grief could be worn as protection. Victorian communities were used to death, particularly among the working poor. Children died of infections that swept through streets and cottages without warning. Men died early from industrial labor, drink, injury, and illness that medicine could name but not reliably treat. A woman who buried a husband was not automatically unusual. A woman who buried more than one could still be explained away as unlucky. That explanation held for a long time because it suited everyone. It allowed neighbors to stay kind, allowed officials to stay cautious, and allowed the ordinary machinery of life to keep moving. Mary Ann had learned how to move with that machinery. She could enter a household and appear exactly as she needed to appear, capable, seasoned, and respectable in the particular way a widow was expected to be. Widowhood was a recognized role. It came with sympathy, lowered suspicion, and practical accommodation. A widow who needed work could take service. A widow who needed stability could remarry quickly without being condemned, because people understood what poverty did to choice. This was the social climate in which she met Frederick Cotton. A widower's house, and the need for a woman. Frederick Cotton was a pitman living in West Auckland, County Durham. He had been married before and was widowed, left with children and a household that needed domestic order. For a working man, a wife was not simply companionship. She was the keeper of the home, cooking, washing, tending sickness, managing the children, maintaining appearances. A widower with children was expected to find a woman who could step into that role. If he did not, the household could unravel quickly. Mary Ann came with the credentials of hard experience: marriage, childbirth, nursing, bereavement. She also came with a past that was not always visible to the people meeting her for the first time. In small communities, reputation traveled, but it rarely traveled cleanly. It arrived in fragments, a whisper here, a half-known tragedy there. A newcomer could still be treated as simply unfortunate. She and Frederick married on September 17, 1870. Bigamy as an invisible risk. By the time she married Frederick Cotton, Mary Ann had previously married James Robinson. The legal and domestic reality of that earlier marriage created a quiet risk. She was not clearly free to marry again. Bigamy existed in the same way many working-class irregularities existed, inside the gaps between law and life. When people moved frequently, when papers were incomplete, when separation happened without formal divorce, marital status could become a matter of convenience until an official reason arose to scrutinize it. In Mary Ann's case, the risk mattered because it reinforced the pattern already forming around her: quick reinvention, quick attachment to new households, and a willingness to take what stability was available without being stopped by legality. The household she entered. Frederick Cotton brought children into the marriage from his first wife. The names most consistently attached to this part of the record are Frederick Cotton Jr., Charles Edward Cotton. These were not infants. They were old enough to register as people beyond the blur of Victorian child mortality. Their presence changed the household dynamic. A stepmother could be accepted, but she was also watched more closely than a biological mother, especially when the children were living reminders of a previous wife. Mary Ann also carried her own history of children and child deaths into this new home, even when those children were not physically present in West Auckland. The impact of that history sat in how she was perceived: a woman hardened by loss, practiced at sorrow, and able to perform it convincingly. There are additional deaths sometimes connected to her arrival in Frederick Cotton's orbit, including the death of Frederick's sister, Margaret Cotton, described in later accounts as a death following a stomach illness. In a strictly factual narrative, this must be handled carefully. Adult illness and death were common. The suspicion here is largely retrospective, shaped by what was later alleged about Mary Ann's pattern. It can be included as part of the atmosphere around the household, but it cannot be stated as proven murder. Pregnancy and consolidation. Soon after her marriage to Frederick Cotton, Mary Ann became pregnant. Pregnancy strengthened her position in a household. A pregnant wife was harder to dismiss and less likely to be challenged openly. Pregnancy also offered an emotional cover that was powerful in Victorian culture: the image of motherhood, the expectation of softness, the assumption of nurture. In 1871 she gave birth to a son, often recorded as Robert Cotton. Even where a child's later fate is debated or unevenly recorded, the birth itself is significant. It tied her to Frederick Cotton's name and property more tightly, and it made her appear less like a temporary replacement for a dead wife and more like the center of a continuing family. It also placed her back in the most trusted domestic role: caregiver within a home that included children who were not hers. Insurance, money, and the language of benefit. West Auckland was not immune to the insurance culture of the time. Working families used burial clubs and small policies as protection against debt and disgrace when someone died. Funerals cost money. If you were poor, a funeral could ruin you. Insurance was meant to prevent that. But insurance also created a second meaning around death: payment. In Mary Ann's story, the repeated presence of insurance becomes difficult to ignore because it appears alongside repeated death. The suspicion is not that insurance existed, but that death and money seemed to follow each other too closely in her households, and that she was described as taking an active interest in the arrangements. This is where motive begins to sharpen in the historical record. Victorian poverty explains why money mattered so much. It does not explain why death so often arrived in the same domestic spaces she controlled. Frederick Cotton's illness. In late 1871, Frederick Cotton fell ill. The symptoms described in later summaries align with the recurring language attached to many deaths around Mary and: stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, rapid decline. In Victorian terms, this could be gastric fever, a stomach complaint, or any number of broad labels that covered both infectious illness and poisoning. A sick room in a poor household was not a place of clinical certainty. It was a place of routine. Drinks were prepared. Broths were made. Powders and remedies were given. A wife was expected to manage much of it. A doctor might visit, but the hours in between were private and unobserved. This was the kind of environment where arsenic could be used without immediate detection, because the symptoms it caused could be mistaken for common illness. It was also the environment where an innocent illness could later be reread as murder once the pattern became public. Frederick Cotton died on December 10, 1871. His death returned Mary and to widowhood once again. Widowhood in her life did not function as an ending. It functioned as a pivot point, the moment where responsibility could be reallocated, where money might be claimed, where a new arrangement could be pursued. The stepchildren as problem. After Frederick's death, Mary Ann remained in a household that included stepchildren. Those children were not hers by blood, and in the harsh accounting of the era, they were a burden unless they could be converted into something else: sympathy, relief, or money. Her approach to the parish about the children's future became one of the key turning points in the broader case, because it brought outsiders, parish officials, into the story in a formal way. It moved the household's private troubles into the world of paperwork, oversight, and recorded conversation. This matters because Mary Ann's earlier pattern depended on privacy. A death inside a home could be absorbed as misfortune. Once officials were involved, misfortune began to look like something that could be questioned. The full consequences of that approach did not unfold immediately in this period, but the seed was planted. The household was no longer sealed. What makes the Frederick Cotton period different? Mary Ann had buried men before Frederick Cotton. The difference in West Auckland was density. This was not one isolated death in a life full of hardship. It was the continuation of a sequence that was already long, now occurring in a small place where people could observe repetition more easily. The household was not simply a marriage. It was a convergence point: stepchildren, pregnancy, insurance, sickness, and the renewed opportunity of widowhood. Frederick Cotton's death was not the moment the law moved, but it was the moment the village began to tighten its attention. The later investigation would treat his death as a key part of the pattern, particularly because it was close in time to the deaths that followed and close to the decisions Mary Ann began to make about the children in her care. Frederick Cotton's burial did not settle the household. It destabilized it. And once a household is destabilized, people start talking in ways they do not talk when life seems orderly. In West Auckland, the talk did not die down. It grew. Chapter 6, Joseph Nattrass. Joseph Nattrass sits awkwardly in Mary Ann Cotton's story because he doesn't fit the public's preferred pattern of neat husbands and numbered children. He was not a man who gave her a surname. He was not a lawful anchor. He was a connection that moved in and out of her life along the same lines as lodging, labor, and convenience. That makes him easy to miss. It also makes him important. Men who marry a woman step into a defined social role. People notice them. They are recorded. A husband's death becomes a public event with formal expectations. A lodger's death can be absorbed more quietly, especially in a working village where lodging arrangements were common and private arrangements were often treated as nobody's business until they became scandal. Nattrass's presence in West Auckland matters because it shows the pattern widening. It suggests that the risk in Mary Ann's household life was not limited to husbands and infants. It extended to anyone close enough to eat her food, take her drink, and fall sick under her roof. A relationship outside marriage. Mary Ann's life after William Mowbray's death drifted through different places and different kinds of relationships. In Seaham Harbour, she was connected with Joseph Nattrass. Some accounts describe him as a lover, others simply place him in her orbit as a man associated with her during that period. That distinction matters in a factual narrative. Victorian working communities did not always record the shape of relationships cleanly, and later retellings can simplify what was messy. What can be said with care is this: Nattrass was a known connection, not a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. He belonged to her history before he belonged to her household. In a life marked by remarriage and shifting domestic roles, a man like Nattrass offered something that did not require ceremony: stability without paperwork. Lodging money, companionship, protection from social scrutiny that clung to lone women, and access to a man's wage without the obligations of being his wife. It was not romance in the way later generations want to imagine it. It was proximity in a hard world. Return to West Auckland. After Frederick Cotton's death, Mary Ann was back in the position she understood best, a widow managing a household under pressure. This time the pressure was sharper. She was surrounded by stepchildren who were not hers by blood and who represented both obligation and risk. She had the vulnerability of widowhood and the urgency of securing her next foothold. It is in this setting that Joseph Nattrass returns as her lodger. A lodger is a practical arrangement. A lodger pays. A lodger makes a house less precarious. A lodger also offers a certain kind of cover. A man under the roof signals that the household is not entirely unguarded. For a widow, that could matter. It could deter opportunists and soften judgment. But a lodger also brings exposure. He is present enough to witness routine. He can overhear talk about money and plans. He can observe the household's rhythms, the way illness is handled, the way food is prepared, the way grief is performed. If he begins to suspect, he becomes dangerous. If he falls ill, he becomes manageable. Nattrass was in the house at a time when the village had begun to watch Mary Ann more closely. West Auckland was not Siem Harbour. It was a smaller circle. People tracked one another's movements and stories. Rumour had less distance to travel. The environment was primed for suspicion. Illness with familiar symptoms. When Joseph Nattrass became ill, later descriptions give the familiar Victorian language: gastric illness, stomach complaint, gastric fever. It is the same language that appears repeatedly around Mary Ann's story because it was the era's catch-all for a cluster of symptoms that could be caused by many things. That is what made arsenic so difficult to detect in ordinary households. Arsenic poisoning commonly produced violent gastrointestinal symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, cramps, weakness, collapse. These symptoms were not distinct enough to alarm a community that saw similar suffering from contaminated food, waterborne illness, seasonal infections, and the constant fragility of the poor. A man could be fine one day and ruined the next. A man could die quickly and be buried quickly, especially if his household could not afford prolonged care. Nattrass's illness, in isolation, would not have forced the village to imagine murder. What changed the meaning of his illness was the setting. He was ill in the same domestic sphere where death had already clustered. The benefit angle and how to handle it honestly. Accounts of Nattrass's death frequently include the detail that Mary Ann stood to gain from him, often expressed as him changing his will or making arrangements that would favor her. This is one of those details that people repeat because it feels like motive made visible. It tightens the narrative. It pushes the reader toward certainty. But the record in cases like this is not always stable on the formality of such arrangements. Some tellings imply a legal will. Others imply an intention spoken aloud, the kind of promise a man might make to a woman he trusted or depended on. The difference matters. A careful factual approach can hold the point without overstating it. Nattrass's death was widely associated, in local understanding and later retellings, with the belief that Mary Ann expected to benefit from him. Whether that expectation was anchored to a formal document or to informal promises, the effect is the same in terms of suspicion. People believed she had something to gain, and that belief sharpened how they interpreted what happened next. It also aligns with the wider pattern that had begun to attach to her name, the sense that death and money kept arriving together. Why a lodger's death is particularly telling. A husband's death can be framed as marital tragedy. A child's death can be framed as illness. A lodger's death is harder to fold into the same sentimental explanations because he isn't bound to the household by blood or lawful duty. A lodger is a choice. He chooses to enter the home. The house chooses to accept him. His presence is transactional. If he dies, it raises a blunt question: why is death happening to people who come under this roof? It is also notable because it hints at how Mary Ann's domestic sphere operated. A home can be dangerous without outsiders realizing it because outsiders rarely witness the routine. A lodger does witness routine. He is present at meals. He sees who prepares them. He watches who controls medicine. He notices what is said about illness and what is done. If that lodger becomes ill and dies, suspicion tends to move swiftly from general unease to specific fear. Nattrass's death added weight to the feeling that something in Mary Ann's orbit was not simply bad luck. The village atmosphere after Nattrass. By the time Joseph Nattrass died, West Auckland was no longer dealing with a single bereavement. It was dealing with accumulation. Even in a century where death was common, accumulation still carried psychological force. People begin to talk differently. They stop offering sympathy automatically. They start asking questions in half phrases. Who was with him? What did he eat? How sudden was it? They compare dates. They compare symptoms. They compare what the widow says now to what she said last time. This is the slow creation of a community case, built not by police but by ordinary observation. Natras's death did not trigger the arrest on its own, but it contributed to the tightening circle that made the next death impossible to absorb quietly. It helped create the sense that Mary Ann's house was a place where people went to be nursed and didn't always come out alive. Mary Ann's position after his death. For Mary Ann, the death of a lodger was both risk and opportunity. It could intensify scrutiny. It could generate talk. It could bring officials closer. It could make the parish system more alert, especially in a household already dealing with stepchildren and relief arrangements. But it could also provide what death had provided before, a shift in circumstances, a chance to reposition herself, and potentially a financial benefit if promises had been made or money was owed. The brutality of this story lies in how ordinary these mechanisms are. Lodging, sickness, death, small sums of money, talk among neighbors, the building blocks of daily working-class life. Nothing about them looks like a crime scene until repetition makes it impossible to pretend they are merely life's roughness. Joseph Natras's death belongs here because it shows that repetition continuing in the open air of the village, not hidden inside the intimacy of marriage alone. And by the time the household moved into the next phase, the stepchildren problem, the workhouse pressure, the looming focus on Charles Edward, the village had already watched one more man go down with the same kind of sickness. One more man, in one more house, with Mary and at the center of the routine. Chapter 7, The Stepchildren, the Workhouse, and the Deaths. That tightened the net. After Frederick Cotton died in December 1871, Mary Ann's position looked familiar on the surface, a widow again, standing in the shadow of a fresh grave. In earlier years that role had served her well. Widowhood brought sympathy. It softened questioning. It granted her a kind of social invisibility, because people preferred to see sorrow rather than calculation. But West Auckland was not giving her the same room. The village was small enough for patterns to be noticed, and the Cotton household was crowded with complications that could not be managed quietly. There were stepchildren in the house, children with a mother already dead, children whose future was now uncertain, children whose presence brought merry and not comfort but inconvenience. This chapter is where the domestic problem becomes a public one. Not because the home suddenly transformed into a crime scene, but because Mary Ann began to speak and act in ways that pulled private intent into public hearing. The stepchildren as a burden, not a bond. Frederick Cotton left behind two sons from his first marriage, Frederick Cotton Jr. and Charles Edward Cotton. When their father died, the boys became Mary Ann's immediate responsibility in practice, even if they were not hers in blood. In a working village, children were not simply dependents. They were labor in the making. They were mouths to feed and bodies to clothe, but they were also future wages. For many families, children were absorbed into the economy of the home as soon as they were old enough to carry water, run errands, or tend younger ones. The Cotton boys, however, were not Mary Ann's investment. They were reminders of another woman. They were ties to Frederick's family that she might not want. They were also witnesses in the only way children can be witnesses, by being present, by watching, by living long enough to notice what adults preferred not to say. A widow could keep her stepchildren out of duty. She could pass them to relatives if relatives were willing. Or she could turn to the parish and the workhouse system, which existed as the final catchment for children who had nowhere else to go. Mary Ann turned toward the workhouse. The workhouse as threat and mechanism. The workhouse was not simply a building. It was a social judgment. It was the place you went when you had failed to survive within the accepted structure of family and labor. For children, it was often the beginning of institutional life, strict routine, discipline, separation from community. In Victorian England, respectable families feared the workhouse. Poor families feared it too, but they also relied on it when there was no alternative. The parish system was both harsh and necessary. It punished dependence and managed it at the same time. For Mary Ann, the workhouse offered a solution. It could remove the stepchildren from her household without requiring her to negotiate a family relationship she might not control. It could reduce her obligations and leave her freer to seek new arrangements. But approaching the parish carried a risk she had avoided in earlier phases of her life. It put her household into official view. Private life survives on the assumption that nobody is watching. Parish relief survives on paperwork, questions, and recorded conversations. Even a small request could bring scrutiny. And scrutiny was what she could least afford. Frederick Cotton Jr., the first child death after the widower's funeral. In the months after Frederick Cotton's death, illness struck again. Frederick Cotton Jr. became sick and died in March 1872. Victorian accounts often place his death among the cluster that deepened suspicion. The same broad language appears again: gastric illness, stomach complaint, fever. It is the language that makes everything difficult, because it could describe natural disease, and it could describe poison. The symptoms blur together. Yet this death mattered because it happened in a household already destabilized by the father's recent death and already under quiet observation. The boy was not an infant. His death felt less expected than the frequent infant deaths that society had grown used to. It was another young life extinguished inside the same home. And it happened under Mary Ann's control. By itself, one boy's death could still have been accepted as misfortune. But it was not occurring by itself. It was occurring in a house where a man had already died months earlier and where the widow was openly discussing removing the remaining children. The shape of it began to look wrong. The baby, Robert, grief that did not slow her. Mary Ann's baby, Robert Cotton, is often recorded as dying in this same period. Child death in infancy was common, and that reality is why the infant's death did not automatically trigger a criminal response. People had seen babies die from diarrhea, malnutrition, infection, and sudden collapse. They had buried infants with no more explanation than it was God's will, or it was the fever. But the infant's death matters in the narrative because of timing. When deaths cluster tightly, adult man, older child, infant, lodger, the mind begins to resist coincidence. Even if each individual death could be explained, the sequence begins to look like a chain. This is where community suspicion often forms, not through one dramatic event, but through a repeated rhythm of funerals. The parish contact, when talk became record. Mary Ann's dealings with parish officials around the children drew key people into the story. This is the point where a household begins to be seen not only by neighbors, but by the machinery of local authority. The assistant overseer, Thomas Riley, becomes important here because his role placed him at the intersection between private desperation and official procedure. A widow asking about the workhouse was not unusual. What Riley encountered, according to later testimony, was something colder than need. Mary Ann was not asking for help keeping the boys. She was asking how to get rid of them. And she spoke in a way that implied she already understood how the situation would resolve itself. The remark that changed the meaning of the next illness. What separated this chapter from earlier phases of her life was not only what happened, but what was said. Mary Ann was reported to have remarked in the context of the workhouse plan that Charles Edward Cotton would not be a problem for long, because he would soon be dead. In a village accustomed to illness, people still recognize the difference between worry and foreknowledge. It is one thing to say a child looks frail. It is one thing to say a fever has him. It is another thing to speak as if death is already arranged. That remark, however precisely it was phrased in the moment, echoed because those who heard it repeated it later with the same sense of alarm. It lodged in memory because it did not sound like grief. It sounded like expectation. Once expectation enters the story, every later symptom changes shape. A stomach complaint becomes a warning sign. A cup of tea becomes suspicious. A powder becomes a possible weapon. The village began listening differently. Why Charles Edward mattered before he even fell ill. Charles Edward Cotton was now the remaining stepchild, the one still alive and still inconvenient. He was also the child Mary and was reported to have spoken about most chillingly. When Frederick Cotton Jr. died, the household narrowed. When the baby died, it narrowed further. When Natris died, suspicion widened outward again. At every stage, Mary Ann stood in the center, still functioning, still making plans, still pushing toward a future that required fewer mouths and more security. By the time Charles Edward's health began to fail, the village was primed for the worst interpretation. The system was primed too, because parish contact meant that officials were already aware of the household. This is how cases like this reach a tipping point. It is not only the killer who changes. It is the environment. The emotional economy of the village. Small villages do not accuse quickly. They rely on each other. They survive on neighborly exchange, help with children, help with sickness, help with food. Accusing someone of poisoning is like lighting a fire under that entire structure. People delay accusation because accusation endangers everyone. It risks retaliation. It risks being wrong. It risks fracturing kin networks. It risks making every household suspicious of every other. So suspicion often lives as whisper until a moment arrives when whisper no longer feels safe. In Mary and Cotton's case, that moment began forming here in this chapter, because the household's private intentions collided with public systems, and because her language about the remaining child sounded too much like prediction. What this chapter locks into place. By the end of this phase, several key elements were already in position. Frederick Cotton was dead, leaving Mary and in control of the household. Frederick Cotton Jr. died in the same household soon after. Robert Cotton's death is often placed in the same period, tightening the cluster. Joseph Nattrass, her lodger, also died after gastric illness, widening suspicion beyond family. Mary and approached the parish about sending the children to the workhouse, bringing officials into the story. A remark attributed to her suggested foreknowledge of Charles Edward's death. Those elements form the scaffolding of what would come next. Charles Edward's illness did not begin the case. It completed it. The village had already seen too many funerals. It had already heard too much. It had already started to connect what had once been treated as separate tragedies. The next time a child began vomiting in Mary and Cotton's care, the community no longer heard fever. It heard pattern. And pattern is what finally makes people act. Chapter 8. Charles Edward Cotton. By the time Charles Edward Cotton began to fail, West Auckland was no longer a village watching an unlucky widow. It was a village watching a sequence. Frederick Cotton was dead. Frederick Cotton Jr. was dead. The baby Robert was gone. Joseph Nattrass had come under the roof and not left it alive. The house had become a place where sickness did not resolve, where stomach pain did not pass, where weakness slid into death with a grim regularity. And Mary was still there at the center of it, managing, speaking, planning. The stepchildren were no longer simply children. They were obstacles. They were costs. They were reminders of a dead wife and a dead husband. They were also the most dangerous kind of living presence in a story like this, witnesses who could grow older. Charles Edward was now the remaining problem. The workhouse plan as a signal flare. Mary Ann's approach to the parish about the children did more than seek relief. It gave the village an official narrative to attach to its private unease. A woman asking about the workhouse could be read as desperate. That explanation was still available. But Mary Ann's focus was not on saving the household. It was on reducing it. The stepchildren were being processed like items in an account, how to remove them, what could be done with them, how quickly. That in itself was enough to set tongues moving. It became worse when the words attributed to her landed in the ears of someone positioned to repeat them formally. Charles Edward, she implied, would not be a problem for long. In the Victorian North, people were used to speaking of illness in fatalistic ways. They had seen children taken by fever overnight. They had seen adults broken by infection, workplace injury, and hunger. But fatalism and foreknowledge are different sounds. One is dread. The other is certainty. When a woman speaks with certainty about a child's impending death, it stains the next illness before it even begins. The purchase that made poison visible. Arsenic sat within reach of ordinary households. It was used for vermin. It appeared in trades and products. It could be obtained with an explanation that sounded sensible: rats. Mary Ann bought arsenic. The reason mattered less than the fact that it created a record. A private crime thrives on privacy. A public record cuts a hole in the privacy wall. It ties an object, poison, to a name that can be spoken in court. To a village already whispering, the purchase looked like confirmation of what they had only half believed. To officials, it provided something that could be written down and used later. Even if the purchase had been innocent, its timing meant it could never remain innocent in interpretation. Once a child fell ill, the arsenic purchase became the first place the mind returned. The illness begins in a household already judged. When Charles Edward began to sicken, it did not feel like the beginning of the story. It felt like the next beat in a rhythm the village had already learned to dread. A stomach complaint. Nausea. Vomiting. Pain that made him restless and then weak. A child who could not hold food. A body that dehydrated and collapsed faster than anyone wanted to admit. Victorian homes were full of small sicknesses. Children vomited and recovered. Adults endured fevers and returned to work. The problem here was not that Charles Edward was sick. The problem was the setting. He was sick in Mary Anne's care. That simple fact, by this stage, changed everything. The domestic advantage, care as control. A poisoner's greatest protection is not cleverness. It is access. In a Victorian home, a wife controlled the sickroom. She prepared food. She made tea. She mixed broths. She administered powders and remedies. Visitors came and went, but the core routine remained hers. That routine was trusted. Neighbors might have offered help, but they did not take over. Men worked away from the house. Officials did not inspect meals. Doctors might visit briefly, but they could not watch what happened hour after hour. The sickroom belonged to the woman who managed it. This is why domestic poisoning can last so long without detection. It hides in the acts that are meant to protect. If Charles Edward was poisoned, the method would not have needed to be dramatic. It would have needed to be ordinary, a pinch in a cup, a dose in food, a repetition small enough to mimic illness rather than announce murder. And if he was not poisoned, if he died of natural illness, the same domestic structure still allowed suspicion to harden, because the structure made it impossible for outsiders to know what was truly given and when. Mary Anne's position in the house gave her both opportunity and cover, regardless of what actually happened behind the closed door. The village response: suspicion turns sharp. At first, people did what communities always do. They watched, they listened, they murmured, they compared. They checked the story against what they already knew. But this time the murmurs did not stay soft. The workhouse plan was already in people's minds. The remark about Charles Edward was already circulating. The arsenic purchase had already been noted. So when the child's illness worsened, the village did not wait for death to begin suspicion. It began suspicion alongside the illness. It anticipated the funeral before the coffin existed. That anticipation is what makes this part of the story so chilling. Death was no longer treated as the unpredictable cruelty of the era. It was treated as something that belonged to Mary Anne's household like a tenant. Medical attention and the limits of the time. Doctors of the period could do little more than observe, treat symptoms, and hope. A child vomiting and collapsing might be treated for infection or gastric illness. Remedies could be administered that soothed temporarily and failed entirely. Even a competent doctor could not reliably distinguish arsenic poisoning from certain natural illnesses by appearance alone, particularly without later chemical testing. This limitation mattered because it made the line between misfortune and murder dependent on circumstance rather than clinical certainty. In Mary Anne's case, circumstance was already loaded. Her circumstances were already unnatural in their accumulation. A doctor might not be able to prove poisoning while the child lived, but the doctor could note suspicion. The doctor could be influenced by the village's fear. The doctor could ask questions and remember details that might later matter. And in a case like this, memory becomes evidence. The death that could not be absorbed. Charles Edward Cotton died in July 1872. In another household, his death might have been mourned and buried with little more than the usual phrases: fever, gastric complaint, God's will. In this household, it was not absorbed. It detonated. The parish contact meant officials were already close enough to take reports seriously. The arsenic purchase meant there was already a trail. The remark about his death meant there was already a sense of intention. The cluster of earlier deaths meant the village was already primed. So when Charles Edward died, the question was not simply what killed him. The question was what has been happening in this house. A death that might have been ordinary became the final piece of a pattern. The move from talk to action. This is the point where everyone knows becomes someone reports. A village can carry suspicion for years if nobody speaks it into authority. But once a parish officer, a chemist, a neighbor, or a doctor repeats the same concerns into an official ear, the case changes shape. It stops being social and becomes procedural. Procedures can be slow, but they are relentless once they start. They create notes, interviews, statements. They pull in names. They pull in dates. They pull in histories Mary Anne had survived because no one had stitched them together before. Charles Edward's death forced stitching. The deaths that came before him began to be revisited not as separate tragedies, but as linked events. The widow's history became relevant. The old marriages became relevant. The earlier child deaths became relevant. The lodger's death became relevant. Mary Ann's ability to reinvent herself through movement began to fail, because the system was now moving faster than she could. The significance of this chapter. Charles Edward Cotton's death sits at the center of this case not because it was the first suspicious death, but because it was the death that arrived when the environment had finally changed. Officials were already aware of the household. The community had already compared notes. Arsenic had already been purchased under Mary Ann's name. A remark suggesting foreknowledge had already been heard and repeated. That convergence is what made the case possible. The law did not catch Mary, and because Victorian society became suddenly insightful about domestic crime. It caught her because, this time, she left enough trace outside the sickroom to make denial difficult. Charles Edward's death became the hinge between private harm and public consequence. After his burial, the story could no longer be contained inside the home. The dead began to return, not in spirit, but in paperwork. Names were spoken again. Bodies were questioned. And the village that had hesitated finally found itself forced to decide what it believed. The next stage was not grief. It was investigation. Chapter 9, Exhumation, Arsenic, Arrest. Once Charles Edward Cotton was buried, the household did not return to normal because there was no normal left to return to. The death did not settle the village. It sharpened it. The rumors that had once floated at the edges of conversation began to harden into something more dangerous, shared certainty. A community can tolerate misfortune. It can even tolerate a run of it. What it cannot tolerate, not for long, is the suspicion that misfortune has been manufactured. Charles Edward's death brought the question out of the home and into the world of officials. It forced people to speak in plain terms. It forced them to write statements instead of whispering into sleeves. It forced the story to acquire a paper trail. And a paper trail is the beginning of a criminal case. The turning of private suspicion into public accusation. The mechanisms of local authority in a place like West Auckland were not glamorous. They were parish officials, constables, magistrates, and medical men who worked within the limits of their time. But those limits did not prevent action once a case became too loud to ignore. The crucial shift occurred when the concerns about Mary and Cotton stopped being social talk and became formal concerns, concerns that could be put before a magistrate, concerns that could justify intervention. Several forces converged. The workhouse discussions had already drawn officials into the household's affairs. The reported remark about Charles Edward's impending death had given suspicion a moral sting. It implied intention. The arsenic purchase gave suspicion an object and a record. The pattern of deaths made coincidence feel less believable with each new funeral. In Victorian England, the law moved most confidently when it could show a specific chain rather than a general fear. Charles Edward's death offered that chain. Arsenic as the hinge between rumor and proof. Arsenic mattered in these cases because it could sit inside ordinary life. It was sold for pests. It could be kept in a cupboard without raising questions. Its symptoms could mimic common illness. But once the possibility of poison was named aloud, arsenic also became a legal tool. It could be traced. It could be tested for. It could be introduced into court as a substance with known effects. The record of purchase was especially important. It meant the prosecution could do something Victorian criminal cases often struggled to do: connect domestic death to an act that happened outside the domestic sphere. A chemist, a transaction, a book entry, these things belonged to public commerce, not private nursing. They could be spoken of with confidence and repeated without relying on emotion. The case was no longer only people around her keep dying. It became she obtained poison. That distinction changed everything. The decision to exhume, disturbing the grave for truth. Exhumation was a drastic step in the 19th century. It was emotionally violent, socially unsettling, and often resisted by families who wanted the dead left in peace. But exhumation was also one of the few ways the law could attempt to move beyond speculation when poison was suspected. It is here that Frederick Cotton's death returned to the center of the story. Frederick had died months earlier, in December 1871, before Charles Edward's death pushed the village into action. At the time of his burial, his illness had been treated as one more tragedy in a hard life. In retrospect, his death became a question mark too large to ignore. If Mary Ann had poisoned Charles Edward, the reasoning went, why would Frederick have been safe? So the body was exhumed. The purpose of exhumation was not only to discover arsenic. It was to demonstrate seriousness. It signaled that the village's whispers had become official suspicion. It told everyone watching that the case was no longer about morality or gossip. It was about forensic inquiry, as far as Victorian science could manage it. Victorian toxicology, imperfect science, powerful impact. The chemical detection of poison in the 19th century was developing rapidly but was not flawless. Even when arsenic was present, interpreting results could be complicated by contamination, by the condition of the body, by burial environment, and by the limits of testing methods. Yet arsenic had one grim advantage: it was often detectable after death, even after burial. That persistence made it a particularly feared poison because it could return later as evidence. In Frederick Cotton's case, testing found arsenic. This did not automatically prove Mary and administered it, but it confirmed that arsenic had been inside his body. In a household already associated with an arsenic purchase and a child's death, that confirmation carried immense weight. It tightened the case. It made it harder to argue that everything was merely unfortunate illness. The dead man in the ground had become a witness. The widening net, revisiting the living story of the dead. Once exhumation and testing entered the picture, authorities did what authorities always do when they sense a pattern: they began revisiting the past. Mary Ann's earlier marriages began to matter. The history of her children began to matter. The repeated stomach illnesses began to be read not as common 19th century misery, but as recurring signature. Even when bodies were not exhumed, memories were exhumed. People who had once shrugged and moved on began re-evaluating what they had seen. Was she too calm after a death? Did she talk about money too quickly? Did she seem to anticipate sickness? Was she eager to move households at the moment grief should have anchored her? Did she show unusual interest in insurance? This retrospective scrutiny is a dangerous thing, because it can distort. But it is also how many long-running domestic crimes are finally recognized. People don't see the pattern when they are inside it. They see it when they are forced to lay events side by side. Mary Ann's life had rarely been laid side by side before. Now it was. Arrest, the point where charm stops working. Mary Ann had survived for years in part because she understood presentation. A grieving widow drew sympathy. A competent nurse drew trust. A woman speaking softly and behaving properly was unlikely to be imagined as a poisoner. Victorian gender assumptions protected her. Communities did not want to believe the home could be murderous. But once a case moves into official procedure, charm has less room to operate. Procedure cares about record, witness, and chain of events. Following Charles Edward's death, the arsenic purchase, and the forensic findings linked to Frederick Cotton, the authorities finally moved to arrest Mary Ann. Her arrest mattered not only because it was the beginning of her end, but because it represented a social rupture. A woman like her was not supposed to be arrested for murder, not in the public imagination. The moment she was taken, the village's fear was validated. The private suspicion was confirmed as plausible. The griefs that had once been treated as separate tragedies became a connected narrative. The community did not have to wonder anymore whether they were being cruel. The state had declared it possible. The selection of a charge, why the law focused on one child. Even at this stage, the authorities were not preparing to prosecute every death attached to her name. They were preparing to prosecute what they could prove. Victorian courts needed a case that could be carried without collapsing into speculation. A string of suspicious deaths could shape perception, but perception alone could not secure conviction. Charles Edward's death was the strongest prosecutable case because it had a documented arsenic purchase tied to Mary Ann, a reported remark suggesting foreknowledge, an illness and death that fit the poison narrative, heightened local scrutiny already in motion, and a household history now supported by arsenic detection in Frederick Cotton's body. In practical terms, the law chose the death that could hold in court. This is why her story later became inflated. The public wanted her tried for everything. The law could only try her for what it could demonstrate. Mary Ann under scrutiny, the end of reinvention. Mary Ann's earlier survival depended on movement. When suspicion rose in one place, she could move to another. When a husband died, she could become a widow elsewhere. When a child died, she could bury and leave. Now movement was no longer possible. Arrest pins a person in place. It gathers the past behind them like a tide. Names, Dates, marriages, children, all the things that had once been scattered across villages were now being assembled into one portrait. It was not a flattering portrait. It was a portrait that made coincidence look increasingly absurd. Whether Mary Ann felt fear, anger, or defiance, the record cannot speak for her interior life with certainty. What it can show is that the moment she was arrested, her life stopped being a series of private tragedies and became a public case. What this chapter establishes. This chapter matters because it marks the transformation from story to prosecution. Charles Edward's death forced the community's suspicion into official channels. The arsenic purchase created a trace outside the home. Exhumation and toxicology pulled Frederick Cotton's death back into the present as evidence. Mary Ann's past began to be assembled into a prosecutable narrative. Arrest ended her ability to escape through remarriage and relocation. From this point forward, the case belonged to the courtroom. Chapter 10: Trial and Execution. When Mary Ann Cotton was brought to trial, the most important thing to understand is what the court was not doing. It was not trying her for a lifetime. It was not convicting her for every funeral linked to her name. It was not setting out to solve every ambiguity that Victorian record-keeping had left behind. The court was doing something narrower and more brutal, selecting one death it believed it could prove, then building a case that would survive scrutiny in law. That death was Charles Edward Cotton. Everything else, earlier husbands, earlier children, lodgers, relatives, hovered around the courtroom like a dark weather system. It shaped atmosphere. It shaped the jury's imagination. It reinforced the sense that this was not a single tragic event, but the sharp end of a long pattern. But the legal spine of the prosecution had to remain focused. A Victorian jury could be horrified by rumor, but it could only convict on evidence that could be presented in recognizable form. So the trial became the state's attempt to do something difficult: translate domestic life into legal proof. The setting: a public appetite for a private horror. By the time proceedings began, the case had already escaped the boundaries of West Auckland. The story of a woman suspected of poisoning those in her care was irresistible to a Victorian public that consumed crime as both entertainment and moral instruction. The newspapers were eager. They framed Mary Ann as a warning: the corruption of motherhood, the betrayal of domestic virtue, the danger of a woman who wore respectability like a costume. They watched her face, her posture, her tone, and reported them as evidence of character. A courtroom was not only a place of law. It was a stage. The public wanted to see what a female poisoner looked like. They wanted her to match their idea of evil. If she did not, they would invent language that made her fit. This mattered because it meant Mary Ann entered court already half convicted in the public mind, and already shaped into a symbol before she was treated as a defendant. The prosecution's problem: how do you prove poison? Arsenic murders rarely offer dramatic scenes. They offer slow suffering. They offer sickbeds. They offer ordinary cups and spoons. Proving poison means proving a chain. The victim's illness fits poisoning. Poison was obtained. The accused had access and opportunity. The accused had a motive. And the accused story does not hold up under scrutiny. The prosecution relied heavily on what Victorian law valued: witness testimony and material trace. The material trace was arsenic. The case drew strength from the record of arsenic purchase connected to Mary Ann, and from forensic findings that made arsenic more than a whispered suspicion. Chemical detection could not recreate the moment of administration, but it could anchor the argument that the victim did not die of ordinary illness alone. In Victorian terms, that was powerful. The domestic narrative in court: the stepmother and the problem child. The prosecution did not need to prove Mary Ann hated Charles Edward. It needed to show that she saw him as a problem and that his death solved something for her. This is where the parish and workhouse discussion became crucial. Mary Ann's interest in sending the children away, and the reported remark that Charles Edward would soon be dead, transformed motive from vague greed into something much more direct: removal. A child in a workhouse was no longer in her control. A child in a grave was no longer in her way. That is the cold logic the court would want the jury to feel without ever having to state it in those terms. The prosecution's narrative cast her not as a woman overcome by grief, but as a woman using death as housekeeping. Witnesses: the village speaks out loud. Trials like this depend on ordinary people choosing finally to speak plainly. The witness list in such cases becomes a portrait of how suspicion travels. Parish officials who heard her speak about the children. Neighbors who observed patterns. movements, and reactions. People who noted her quickness to discuss money and arrangements. The chemist whose sale created a record. Medical men who described symptoms and the limitations of their ability to distinguish illness from poison. In court, these voices do not sound like gossip anymore. They sound like testimony. They are sharpened by procedure. They are forced into dates and statements. This is where a village's fear becomes formal. It is also where Mary Ann's social performance began to fail. The widow's posture cannot easily survive direct questioning. A careful mask can crack when details are repeated back by multiple witnesses. The role of medical evidence, science as leverage, not certainty. Victorian toxicology could detect arsenic. That fact gave the prosecution leverage. But it did not give them omniscience. The medical evidence in such a trial does not arrive as a neat modern autopsy report. It arrives as a combination of observation and chemistry, what symptoms were seen, what testing revealed, what experts could say about arsenic's effects and detectability after death. The presence of arsenic in the body was the key, because it pushed the death beyond ordinary gastric illness. For a jury, it meant the difference between tragedy and crime. The defense's position, misfortune, disease, and disbelief. Mary Ann's defense could only work with what Victorian society already wanted to believe, that death was common, that illness looked like poison, and that a woman, particularly a mother, was inherently less likely to murder. The defense would lean on the era's broad medical labels and the high mortality of the time. It would suggest that the child died of natural causes. It would question whether arsenic could have been introduced accidentally. It would attempt to cast doubt on the credibility of witnesses whose suspicion had grown after the fact. Underlying all of it was the unspoken plea, "Are you prepared to believe this woman did this?" That plea was not trivial. Victorian juries were often reluctant to convict women of violent crimes unless the evidence was overwhelming, because the cultural idea of womanhood resisted the image of a female killer. But Mary Ann's case did not present as a single isolated tragedy. It presented as pattern and trace can overcome disbelief. The jury and the weight of the pattern. Even though Mary Ann was tried for one death, the jury could not unknow what they had heard about her life. The other funerals, the other illnesses, the repeated widowhood, the repeated cluster of child deaths, they created a background hum that made the prosecution's case feel more plausible. This is how patterns function in court. They are not always entered as formal evidence for conviction, but they shape the atmosphere in which evidence is interpreted. A jury does not evaluate facts in a vacuum. It evaluates them in a world. Mary Ann's world, by then, was crowded with the dead. Verdict and sentence. When the verdict came, it was not simply the end of the trial. It was the state declaring that the domestic sphere, so long treated as private and morally protected, had contained a murderer. Mary Ann Cotton was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence reflected not only the gravity of the child's death but the cultural shock attached to the case. A woman who poisoned a child under her care struck at the Victorian heart, the belief that the home was safe, that mothers and stepmothers were naturally protective, that femininity itself carried moral restraint. The law did not sentence symbols. It sentenced a person. But society treated her as both. Execution, the final act and the lingering story. Mary Ann Cotton was executed by hanging in 1873. Execution in Victorian England was meant to be more than punishment. It was meant to be instruction. It was the state's way of asserting control over fear. We can identify evil, we can isolate it, we can remove it. But execution does not erase a story. It often enlarges it. For many, her hanging became the moment the narrative could be sealed into certainty. If the state killed her, she must have been guilty of everything. That is how public imagination works. The legal system chooses what it can prove. Public memory extends the verdict into a lifetime. The women who had buried children began to wonder again about their own losses. The men who had known her began to replay conversations. The community began to reframe its own history around her presence. The court had ended her life. It had not ended the case's life. What this chapter locks in. This trial matters because it shows the final conversion of domestic suspicion into state punishment. The prosecution focused on the death it could prove. Arsenic created a trace that could withstand court procedure. The workhouse plan and reported remark created motive and foreknowledge. Witness testimony turned village whisper into sworn narrative. Conviction and execution sealed the story into public infamy. Chapter 11, Aftermath. Mary and Cotton's execution did not end anything neatly. It ended her life, but it did not end the damage. The damage moved outward, away from the prison, away from the courtroom, and back into the villages and streets where her name had once been spoken without fear. An execution is meant to close a case. In practice, it often opens it wider. The public takes the state's certainty and spreads it across every earlier doubt. A conviction for one murder becomes assumed guilt for many. Rumor becomes accepted history. People begin counting coffins as if numbers alone can explain how a woman could move through households leaving so much death behind her. But the aftermath of a case like this is not only a story about numbers. It is a story about survivors, those who remained alive long enough to carry the weight of association. The children who lived, survival without freedom. The most common simplification attached to Mary and Cotton is that she killed everyone close to her. The record does not allow that comfortingly absolute version. Some children survived her. This is part of what made her story so difficult for Victorian communities to process. If she was truly a poisoner, why did some children live? And if some lived, did that mean the others died naturally? People wanted certainty because certainty made the world easier to inhabit. The messy truth was that survival does not always mean safety, and death does not always mean murder, but pattern makes both feel connected. The best-known surviving child from her life was George Robinson, the son she bore with James Robinson. He survived largely because Robinson removed Mary and from the household and kept the boy with him. This decision is one of the clearest examples of someone close to her acting on suspicion in a way the wider community did not yet dare to. For a child like George Robinson, survival carried its own punishment. He would not have lived as George Robinson, ordinary child. He would have lived as the son of Mary and Cotton. In Victorian society, where moral judgment clung to families like smoke, such association could follow a person for life. Surviving children were not only victims of a mother's actions, they were also victims of what the world did with her story. The men who survived, the witness problem. Most of the men Mary and married did not survive her. That is the reason her case still grips the public imagination, the repeated conversion of husbands into widowers' graves. But one man did survive and matters precisely because he did. James Robinson became the living counterpoint to the dead husbands. He was not simply a tragic figure left behind. He was a man who expelled her, accused her of wrongdoing, and retained custody of their child. His survival created a living testimony that later retellings leaned on heavily. In many versions of her story, Robinson becomes the good man who saw the truth. The reality was likely less tidy. In working-class life, people acted for many reasons at once: suspicion, frustration, financial pressure, moral outrage, fear. He may not have understood the full danger at first. He may have suspected theft before murder. But he acted decisively enough to break the pattern in his home. After her conviction, his survival would not have felt like triumph. It would have felt like contamination. He had invited her into his household. His children died while she was there. His life became a footnote in a national scandal. The public always wants a witness to be clean and heroic. In reality, witnesses are often just people who lived long enough to regret what they didn't see sooner. The Cotton family, grief turned into public property. Frederick Cotton's family lost more than Frederick. They lost the privacy of their mourning. Once Mary Ann was arrested and tried, every death connected to that household became a public item. The dead become evidence. The living become suspects by association. The family's grief is no longer theirs to carry quietly. It is dragged into discussion, examined, questioned, and judged. Families in cases like this are often asked the most brutal question after the fact: why didn't you stop her? It is an unfair question dressed as moral certainty. It assumes people can see patterns clearly while they are still inside them. It assumes that a working family, accustomed to illness and death, should have been able to distinguish murder from misfortune without the tools that even doctors lacked. After the trial, Frederick Cotton's relatives would have been forced to replay every detail. Who last saw Frederick well? Who prepared food? What was said about insurance? How quickly Mary Ann moved toward parish discussions. Whether Margaret Cotton's earlier illness had been more than illness. And they would have replayed those details knowing the world was watching. The worst part of scandal is that it makes ordinary people feel as though they were collaborators in their own grief. The village, shame, suspicion, and the need to rewrite memory. West Auckland did not simply survive Mary and Cotton's case. It absorbed it. A village is a living organism. It depends on trust, even when trust is imperfect. When a notorious domestic crime emerges from within it, the village develops a defensive instinct to explain why it happened, why it wasn't seen earlier, and why it won't happen again. That instinct often becomes moral rewriting. People begin to claim they always knew. They begin to frame suspicion as certainty. They begin to create a neat timeline in which warning signs were obvious. This is not always deliberate lying. It is psychological self-protection. It is easier to live with a story where danger was visible than with a story where danger was hidden in plain sight. But the reality is that communities hesitate to accuse, particularly when accusation targets a woman in a domestic role. They hesitate because accusation fractures relationships, because the cost of being wrong is social ruin, and because the cost of being right can still be terrifying. So the village lived with suspicion until Charles Edward's death, and the arsenic record made silence riskier than speech. Afterward, the village had to live with the knowledge that its delay may have allowed more death. The press, turning one conviction into a lifetime of certainty. The Victorian press did not treat Mary and Cotton as a woman convicted of one murder. It treated her as a symbol of domestic evil. This is how her body count began to swell. Newspapers thrived on lists. Lists turned grief into spectacle. Each additional death added horror. Each additional suspected victim increased sales. The public's appetite for sensational certainty did what it always does: it erased nuance. Suspected deaths became known deaths. Contested details became agreed details. Vague medical labels became proof of poisoning. Every husband's illness was retold as deliberate murder. The case became a story that could be consumed quickly, and quick consumption requires simplification. This is where the infamous numbers took root. They were not produced by careful archival work. They were produced by repetition. The record problem: why the truth is harder than the legend. Even without sensationalism, Mary and Cotton's case contains genuine archival difficulty. Working-class families moved frequently. Children's names were reused. Medical causes were broad. Deaths were sometimes recorded inconsistently. Postmortems were rare. Arsenic could mimic common illness. These conditions are why she could operate for so long and why later generations struggle to reconstruct exactly who died and when. This is also why the modern urge to produce a definitive victim list can become misleading. A definitive list suggests the record is neat. It isn't. The most responsible historical stance holds a careful distinction. What was proven in court? What is strongly supported by forensic findings, such as arsenic detected after exhumation? What remains suspicious by repetition and circumstance? What cannot be stated without inventing certainty the archive does not provide? A book that aims to be factual gains credibility by admitting this. It does not weaken the story. It makes it more trustworthy. Cultural afterlife: why she still haunts the imagination. Mary and Cotton's story endured because it attacked Victorian faith in the home. The home was meant to be moral. The wife was meant to be nurturing. The mother was meant to protect. A woman who poisoned those in her care turned these ideals inside out. That is why she became a warning story, repeated not only as crime but as moral lesson. She became proof that domestic virtue could be performed. She became proof that care could conceal harm. She became proof that evil did not always arrive with violence in the street, it could arrive in a cup offered at the bedside. That fear is not purely Victorian. It remains modern because domestic harm remains the hardest harm to detect. It hides behind privacy, behind trust, behind the roles people are trained to believe in. What the aftermath leaves us with. After the trial and execution, the case continued in other forms. In the lives of surviving children. In the reputations of families forced to carry her name. In village memory that rewrote itself to survive. In press narratives that inflated certainty. In later retellings that turned a real case into a legend. The law closed its file. The world did not. Chapter 12, The Count, the Myth. And the Need for a Clean Ending. After Mary and Cotton was hanged, the legal story ended with a single conviction. The public story did not. It did what public stories always do when a case is both horrifying and incomplete. It expanded until it felt complete. The expansion happened in two ways at once. First, people began to count. They wanted a number that matched their shock. They wanted an answer that could be repeated easily. Second, people began to smooth the narrative. They wanted motive to be singular, method to be consistent, and Mary and to be legible as either monster or victim. The messy texture of Victorian life, disease, poverty, and the ordinary fragility of the poor, resisted that neatness, so the public story pushed it aside. This chapter is about what grew after her death, the tally, the myth, and the cultural desire for a clean ending. Why people demanded a number. Numbers feel like control. A number promises comprehension. If you can say she killed this many, then you can stop thinking about the uncertainty that sits beneath each death, the lack of autopsies, the broad medical labels, the gaps in parish records, the way families reused children's names, the way people moved between towns and left faint traces in paperwork. A number offers a simple moral geometry: larger number, larger evil. This is why Mary and Cotton's alleged body count ballooned so easily in retelling. It was not enough to say she was convicted of murdering a child. The public wanted the story to match the horror they felt. They wanted the scale to justify the fascination. So the number became part of her identity. In some tellings, the number is presented with confidence, as though every death is documented and proven. In reality, the certainty is often borrowed, not from the archive, but from repetition. How the legend absorbed ordinary Victorian death. Victorian England was a place where children died often, where illness was common, and where the poor lived close to hunger and infection. That reality complicates the story because it means some deaths linked to Mary and could have been natural. It also explains why suspicion did not immediately become prosecution. But legend does not like context. Legend treats every stomach illness as poison. It treats every fever as deliberate. It treats every burial as proof of malice. It erases the brutal background that made the case possible in the first place. This erasure has an emotional appeal. It allows the audience to imagine that only murder could explain repeated death. It removes the uncomfortable truth that Victorian life itself was dangerous, and that danger created cover for anyone who wanted to exploit it. In doing so, legend creates a clean villain and a clean story. The cost is accuracy, the inheritance powder, and the simplification of method. Arsenic is often described as the perfect Victorian weapon because it sat within ordinary life. It could be purchased for rats. It could be kept without alarm. It mimicked common illness. It was difficult to detect without testing. In many cases, it could even remain detectable after burial, returning as evidence. That reality made arsenic both feared and mythologized. In popular retellings, Mary and Cotton becomes an arsenic machine, a woman who used one method repeatedly with clinical consistency. This image is satisfying because it gives the story a signature. But real life rarely repeats so neatly. Even if she did use arsenic repeatedly, the circumstances of each household would have differed. Dosage would have differed. Access would have differed. Witnesses would have differed. Illnesses that were natural could have occurred alongside poisonings. The archive cannot always distinguish between them. The myth insists on uniformity. The record insists on complexity. Motive becomes a single word: money. Money was present in her life. Poverty was present in her life. Insurance was present in her life. These are facts that can be stated without romance. In the public story, however, motive becomes simplified into one clean explanation: greed. Greed is easy to understand. It is also narratively satisfying because it removes the need to consider anything else. It turns domestic murder into a straight exchange, life for payment. But Victorian poverty complicates motive because money was not a luxury. Money meant rent. Money meant food. Money meant burial costs. Money meant avoiding the workhouse. A small insurance payout could be the difference between surviving and collapsing. This does not soften her actions. It shows why money sat so close to death in working-class life. When poverty is constant, financial decisions become urgent, and the temptation to treat death as a solution becomes more imaginable for someone already inclined to manipulate. The public story prefers greed because greed makes her feel alien. The historical context makes her feel uncomfortably human. The female criminal as cultural warning. Mary and Cotton's legend grew so large because she was not only a criminal. She was the wrong kind of woman. Victorian society depended on the belief that women, particularly mothers, were naturally moral guardians of the home. A woman who murdered within the home threatened the whole ideological structure. If she could do it, then virtue was not guaranteed by gender. If she could do it, then domestic life could conceal horrors without outsiders noticing. So her story became a warning. The press and popular retellings leaned into the idea that she was unnatural. They framed her as a deviant mother, a false wife, a domestic predator. This framing served two purposes at once. It allowed society to place her outside normal womanhood. It reassured society that ordinary women remained safe and trustworthy. It was safer to believe she was a monster than to accept that her crimes could be accomplished using ordinary roles and ordinary trust. Why the record refuses to give a clean ending. A clean ending would require a definitive accounting, a final list of victims, proven by documentation and forensic certainty. The record does not provide it. Some deaths in her orbit are strongly suspicious by pattern. Some have later forensic support through exhumation and arsenic detection. Many sit in a fog created by the era's limitations, broad diagnoses, lack of autopsies, inconsistent records, and the ordinary prevalence of death among the poor. This is why any responsible narrative must do something the public story refuses to do: hold uncertainty without becoming vague. The distinction matters. Proven in court, the murder of Charles Edward Cotton. Supported by later forensic findings, deaths where arsenic was detected after exhumation. Suspected by repetition and circumstance, other deaths linked to her households. Uncertain, deaths that cannot be confidently described as murder without inventing certainty the archive cannot sustain. This structure is less sensational than a single body count, but it is more honest. It also makes the story more frightening, not less, because it reveals how much can remain unknowable when violence hides inside ordinary life. The modern appetite, why her story keeps resurfacing. In modern true crime, Mary Ann Cotton is often framed as a Victorian archetype, the poisoner as domestic serial killer. Her story is revisited because it fits modern interests. The psychology of female offenders. The private nature of domestic crime. The interplay of poverty and motive. The tension between appearance and reality. The discomfort of care turning into harm. Modern retellings often repeat the same myths because myths are easier to sell than nuance. Yet the core facts remain compelling even without inflation. A woman was convicted of poisoning a child in her care, and a broader pattern of death surrounded her life so thickly that the village finally broke its own silence. That is enough. What the story becomes if we strip away the myth. When the legend is removed, what remains is still brutal. A woman moved through multiple households. Illness and death followed repeatedly. Her role as caregiver gave her access. Her social position protected her from suspicion longer than a man might have been protected. The system moved only when paperwork, arsenic records, and a child's death aligned into a prosecutable chain. If this is the true spine of the case, then the exact number matters less than the mechanism. The mechanism is what makes the story enduring. Closing the narrative without pretending certainty. A factual manuscript does not need a dramatic flourish. It needs a responsible ending. Mary Ann Cotton's life does not resolve into a perfect count. It resolves into a proven act and a surrounding pattern that remains the subject of historical suspicion. The legend will always shout numbers. The archive will always answer with quieter, more hesitant language. That hesitation is not weakness. It is accuracy. The final truth is that Mary Ann Cotton was able to operate within ordinary structures, marriage, caregiving, poverty, insurance, and use those structures as cover. Her story is not only about one woman's cruelty. It is about how long a community can live beside death before it dares to call it murder. And it is about how, even after the rope did its work, the dead still did not settle. They became a count. They became a myth. They became a warning that the home, no matter how respectable it appears from the street, can hide a darkness that looks like care. Appendixes. Appendix A, Exhumation Summary. Reconstructed from trial evidence and contemporary reporting. Subject, Mary Ann Cotton. Period of exhumations, 1872 to 1873. Authority, Durham magistrates, acting on coroner and prosecution requests. Purpose, chemical analysis for suspected arsenic poisoning. Overview, following Mary Ann Cotton's arrest in 1872, authorities ordered the exhumation of several bodies connected to her household and movements. No single official exhumation register survives. Instead, Knowledge of these exhumations comes from trial testimony, contemporary newspaper reporting, medical and chemical expert statements, later reconstructions based on court records. What follows is a best-supported summary, based on overlapping sources. Bodies known or strongly believed to have been exhumed. Frederick Cotton. Relationship, fourth husband. Burial location, West Auckland. Status, confirmed exhumation. Frederick Cotton's body was exhumed during the investigation. Chemical analysis detected arsenic. This finding formed the central forensic evidence presented at trial. His death was the specific charge for which Mary Ann Cotton was convicted. Certainty level, high. Charles Edward Cotton. Relationship, stepson. Burial location, West Auckland. Status, confirmed exhumation. Charles Edward Cotton's body was exhumed after his death in 1872. Arsenic was detected. Evidence relating to his death was used to demonstrate pattern and intent, even though the indictment focused on Frederick Cotton. Certainty level, high. Bodies possibly exhumed, probable but not fully documented. George Ward. Relationship, second husband. Burial location, South Hetton. Status, probable exhumation. Several contemporary reports suggest that Ward's remains were examined. Some sources state arsenic was found, others are less explicit. No single surviving laboratory report confirms the result. Most modern historians treat Ward as likely exhumed, but acknowledge incomplete documentation. Certainty level, medium. William Mowbray. Relationship, first husband. Burial location, Sunderland. Status, uncertain. Later reconstructions sometimes claim Mowbray was exhumed. However, no trial testimony explicitly confirms this. It is possible his death was discussed without physical exhumation, based on symptom similarity. Certainty level, low. Bodies almost certainly not exhumed. Early child victims, 1860s. Many children were buried years earlier. Graves were often unmarked or reused. Exhumation would have been impractical or impossible. These deaths were introduced as contextual evidence, not forensic proof. Forensic methods used. During the early 1870s, arsenic detection relied on chemical testing such as the Marsh test. Related analytical methods. Limitations included decomposition, soil contamination, inconsistent preservation. Importantly, detection confirmed presence, not timing or dosage. Forensic science could support suspicion, not independently establish guilt. This is why the prosecution relied on pattern, opportunity, and motive, rather than science alone. What the exhumations proved, and did not prove. They did show. Arsenic was present in key bodies. Poisoning was consistent across cases. Deaths were not purely accidental. They did not show who administered the poison, when it was administered, exact quantities, intent on their own. The exhumations confirmed a narrative already formed through survival, observation, and record comparison. Author's note. Detailed exhumation records from the investigation into Mary Ann Cotton do not survive in full. This summary reflects the strongest available evidence from trial testimony and contemporary reporting. Where certainty is not possible, it is explicitly stated. Appendix B Victim Timeline. Editorial approach. This appendix prioritizes accuracy over completeness. Only cases supported by reliable documentation or strong scholarly consensus are included. 1865, William Mowbray. Relationship, first husband. Year of death, 1865. Location, Sunderland. Recorded cause, gastric illness. Insurance, burial policy. Notes, first documented spousal death showing later pattern. 1866, George Ward. Relationship, second husband. Married, August 28, 1865. Year of death, October 20th, 1866. Location, South Hetton. Recorded cause, intestinal disorder. Insurance, life policy. Notes, symptoms mirrored Mowbray's, no inquest. 1870, Margaret Robinson. Relationship, employer, nursing patient. Year of death, c. 1870. Location: Siam Harbour. Recorded cause: gastric illness. Notes: death preceded marriage to James Robinson. Robinson child. Relationship: stepson/stepdaughter. Outcome: 1 death, 1 survival after removal. Notes: first documented interruption of exposure. 1872, Frederick Cotton. Relationship: 4th husband. Year of death: 1872. Location: West Auckland. Recorded cause: gastric fever. Insurance: £35 life policy. Notes: charge on which conviction rested. 1872, Frederick Cotton Jr., stepson. Died March 1872. 1872, shortly after, Robert Cotton, Mary Ann's infant son. Died soon after Frederick Jr., often placed spring 1872, but exact day varies by source. 1872, Joseph Nattrass, lover/lodger. Died April 1872, after revising will in her favour, per 1 reconstruction. Summer 1872, Charles Edward Cotton. Relationship: stepson. Outcome: survived and then passed away. Notes: survival prompted investigation. Bibliography. Primary sources: The Trial of Mary and Cotton, Durham Assizes, 1873. Durham County Court and Coroner's Records, 1860 to 1873. Victorian Death Certificates and Burial Registers. Medical and Forensic Works. Taylor, Alfred Swain. On Poisons in Relation to Medical Jurisprudence. Burney, Ian. Poison, Detection and the Victorian Imagination. Watson, Catherine D., Poisoned Lives. Secondary Historical Sources. Smith, David James. The Sleep of Reason. Fraser, Antonia. The Weaker Vessel. Wilson, Colin. A Plague of Murder. Whittington Egan, Richard. The Bedside Book of Murder. Social and Contextual Studies. Walkowitz, Judith. City of Dreadful Delight. Hurren, Elizabeth. Dying for Victorian Medicine. Davidoff, Leonore and Hall, Catherine. Family Fortunes.